The file does not have a name, it only has a frequency. In the summer of 1997, a hydrophone array buried deep beneath the southern Pacific Ocean recorded a sound that defied the laws of biology. It was not a whale. It was not a submarine. It was not an underwater earthquake. It was a single, organic, undulating noise that rose from the abyss and traveled for nearly 3,000 miles without losing its power. To understand the scale of this anomaly, you must understand the silence of the deep ocean. A blue whale, the largest animal to ever exist on Earth, can call out across an ocean basin, but its voice fades. This sound did not fade. It was captured by sensors located thousands of miles apart. Sensors that were originally designed during the darkest days of the Cold War to track the faint, rhythmic thrum of Soviet nuclear engines. When the analysts at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration (NOAA) first looked at the spectrogram, they didn't see a machine. They saw the signature of a living creature. But for a creature to make a sound that loud, heard from the coast of Chile to the frozen edges of Antarctica, it would have to be physically larger than any organism known to science. They stamped the file with a placeholder name, locked the coordinates, and tried to rationalize the impossible. But the data remained. The ocean had spoken, and for the first time in history, we were terrified to listen back. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound now is the quiet hum of the server room. The air here is recycled, cool, and sterile. We are standing in the digital archives, surrounded by towers of magnetic tape and hard drives that hold the memory of the world. The file is cold to the touch, or at least, the screen feels cold as we pull up the digital scan. The ink on the original 1997 report has faded with secrets, the paper yellowing at the edges, smelling of dust and ozone. Take a moment to settle into this space. The outside world is chaotic, loud, and unveiled. But here, in the archive, there is only data. There is only the truth of what was recorded. Imagine the lights dimming. Imagine the flicker of a monochrome monitor, the cursor blinking, waiting for a command. We are accessing the logs of the United States Navy's sound surveillance system. The headers are redacted. The timestamps are precise. We are about to descend 3,000 meters below the surface, into a world where light does not exist, and where sound is the only reality. Relax. Focus on the data. The dive begins now. To understand the anomaly, we must first understand the instrument that found it. The story of this sound does not begin in 1997. It begins decades earlier. In the paranoid silence of the 1950s, the United States Navy faced a terrifying problem. The Soviet Union was developing a new class of submarines, vessels capable of staying submerged for weeks, carrying nuclear payloads to the coastlines of the Atlantic and the Pacific. These submarines were the ultimate stealth weapon. They were invisible to radar. They were invisible to satellites. In the vast opaque darkness of the ocean, a submarine is effectively a ghost, but a ghost still makes a footprint, and in the ocean, that footprint is sonic. The Navy initiated a project of absolute secrecy, known as Project Caesar. The goal was ambitious and physically dangerous. To wire the ocean floor, they needed to install a global network of hydrophones, massive underwater microphones anchored to the continental shelves, listening 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This network was called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. This was not a simple task of dropping microphones into the water. The engineers had to exploit a phenomenon of physics known as the SOFAR channel, the sound fixing and ranging channel. You see, the ocean is not a uniform block of water. It is a layered cake of temperatures and pressures. Near the surface, the water is warm. Deep down, the pressure is immense. But trapped between the warm upper layers and the cold, pressurized depths, there exists a specific layer, usually around 1,000 meters down, where sound gets trapped. In the SOFA channel, sound waves do not dissipate. They bounce off the warm water above and the high pressure below, focusing into a tight beam that can travel for thousands of miles with almost zero loss of energy. It is a natural planetary waveguide. A whisper in the SOFA channel near Hawaii can be heard clearly in California. The Navy knew this. They placed their SLS-US arrays directly into this channel. For 40 years, men sat in windowless rooms, wearing heavy headphones, listening to the raw feed of the Pacific Ocean. They became experts in the acoustic signature of the world. They could identify the mechanical whine of a specific turbine on a Soviet Victor-class submarine. They could distinguish the shifting of tectonic plates. They could hear the mating calls of whales, identifying the species by the interval of their clicks. They catalogued everything. They built a library of the ocean's voice. Every mechanical sound had a file. Every biological sound had a file. The ocean was a known quantity. It was a mapped grid of acoustic data. Until the summer of 1997, the sensors involved were part of the Equatorial Pacific Ocean Autonomous Hydrophone Array. This was a piece of military hardware that had been handed down to civilian scientists after the Cold War thawed. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and the Navy allowed NOAA researchers access to the SOSUS data, primarily to track whale migrations and underwater volcanic activity. It was supposed to be a time of peaceful research. The paranoia of the Cold War was over. The screens were monitoring nature, not nuclear warheads, but the machine doesn't care about politics. The machine simply records vibrations, and on that particular day, the needles on the seismographs didn't just twitch, they spiked. The sound began at a low frequency. It was an ultra-low frequency event, vibrating below the range of human hearing, but when sped up to audible levels, it took on a distinct, terrifying shape. It wasn't the sharp crack of an iceberg fracturing. Icequakes produce distinct, jagged they look like shattered glass on the monitor. This sound was different. On the visual display, the sound wave was smooth. It curved. It had a sweeping quality, rising in frequency rapidly over a period of about 1 minute. This rise is the signature of biology. Living things modulate their voices. They control the expulsion of air or the vibration of organs. A machine stays constant. An explosion is instant, but a call rises and falls. The analysts looked at the coordinates. The triangulation pointed to a remote, desolate patch of the South Pacific, west of the southern tip of South America. This is one of the most isolated regions on the planet. There are no shipping lanes here. There are no oil rigs. There is only the abyssal plain, a flat, featureless expanse of mud and darkness stretching for millions of square miles. The volume of the sound was the variable that made no sense. Based on the intensity received at the sensors, which were located 3,000 miles apart, the source level of the sound had to be well over 200 decibels. To put that in perspective, the engine of a jet taking off is about 140 decibels. Every 10 decibels represents a 10-fold increase in intensity. A sound of 200 decibels underwater is a shockwave. It is enough to vibrate the hull of a ship. It is enough to kill a human diver instantly. If an animal made this sound, the physiology required to produce it is baffling. A blue whale, the loudest known animal, tops out around 188 decibels. This sound was significantly more powerful. If it was biological, the creature would need a resonance chamber lung or an air sac larger than a city bus. The file was flagged. The date was recorded, and the name Bloop was given to the anomaly, a whimsical name that belied the dark implications of the data. Because if the calculations were correct, something was swimming in the deep Pacific that was nearly twice the size of a blue whale, and we had never seen it. We had never caught it on sonar. We had never seen a carcass wash ashore. We only heard it, once, screaming into the SOFR channel, and then, silence. But the true horror of the archives isn't just one sound. It's the realization that the SOSUS network, this global ear pressed against the ocean floor, has heard other things too. Things that didn't get a catchy name. Things that were marked classified and never handed over to NOAA. The Bloop was the most famous. The one that leaked to the public and fueled internet forums for decades. But in the quiet, temperature-controlled rooms of the Naval Oceanographic Office, the Bloop was just one file in a drawer full of anomalies. The ocean is not just noisy, it is rhythmic, and sometimes, it is calculating. Consider the file dated March 1st, 1999. The anomaly is labeled Julia. Unlike the Bloop, which was a rapid organic rise, Julia was a moan. It lasted for approximately 15 seconds. It was recorded by the Autonomous Hydrophone Array in the Equatorial Pacific, the same network that heard the Bloop. When you look at the visual data for Julia, it's haunting. It doesn't look like the sharp, chaotic scratch of tectonic plates grinding together. It looks almost melodic. It coos the official explanation, the one released in the brief, sterilized press releases, that Julia was the sound of a massive iceberg running aground off Antarctica. The friction of millions of tons of ice scraping against the seafloor can, theoretically, produce a groaning sound. It is a comforting explanation. It tells us that the world is just rocks and ice, physics and friction. But there is a problem with the friction theory. Friction is inconsistent. When a car scrapes a guardrail, the sound screeches, halts, changes pitch erratically. Julia was smooth. It had a sustained, wavering quality, like a vocal cord holding a note. If it was an iceberg, it was an iceberg that knew how to sing. And then, there is the train, recorded on March 5, 1997. This sound is perhaps the most unnerving of all because it sounds exactly like its name. It resembles the distant, rhythmic chugging of a massive locomotive. It is mechanical, it is steady, and it is loud. The train signal is not a singular event. It is a steady drone that rises out of the background noise of the ocean, stays consistent, and then fades. The official classification: iceberg grounding. Again, the archives use iceberg the way the Air Force uses weather balloon. It is a catch-all term for we don't know, or we can't say, but ask yourself, does a grounding iceberg create a rhythmic, mechanical beat? Does ice vibrating against rock create a steady metronomic pulse that mimics a piston engine? The Tier 1 hydrophone operators, the men and women who spent their careers distinguishing between a Soviet diesel engine and a humpback whale, know that nature rarely moves in perfect time. Biology is messy. Geology is chaotic. Only two things create perfect rhythm: machines and intelligence. This brings us to the slowdown sound. Recorded on May 19, 1997. This sound has a duration of 7 minutes. It was loud enough to be picked up by 3 separate sensors across a range of 2,000 kilometers. The sound descends in frequency, slowly, deliberately, like an aircraft powering down its engines, or a massive heart slowing its beat. If you layer these sounds together, the bloop, Julia, the train, slow down, a picture begins to form that is far more complex than ice moving in the dark. We are seeing a soundscape of the deep that suggests activity. The ocean floor is not a graveyard, it is a highway. The implications of the SOSUS data go beyond mere monsters. They touch on the history of the Cold War itself. In 1968, the nuclear submarine USS Scorpion, SSN 589, vanished in the Atlantic. 99 men were lost. The official story is a tragic accident, a torpedo malfunction, or a battery explosion, but the SOSUS network was listening that day. The hydrophones picked up the acoustic signature of the Scorpion's death. The Navy has released some of this data, but there are rumors, persistent, quiet rumors among archival researchers, that the acoustic record contains extra sounds that occurred before the implosion, sounds that suggest the Scorpion was not alone in the dark. Did the hydrophones pick up a collision, or did they pick up an interaction? The frantic redaction of the SOSUS logs from that specific time window suggests that the Navy heard something they couldn't explain to the public, or perhaps couldn't explain to the President. The file on the Scorpion remains one of the most protected documents in the Naval Archive. We are left with the silence of the 99 men, and the recordings of their final moments, locked in a vault, forever categorized as top secret. Voice direction: pause. Let the silence hang for a beat, then shift to a more analytical, scientific tone. We are breaking down the science of the deep sound channel. To give the audience retention value, let's analyze the environment again. We mentioned the SOFAR channel earlier. It is important to grasp just how perfect this channel is for communication. Evolution is efficient. On land, animals developed eyes because light is abundant. In the deep ocean, light is non-existent. So, evolution prioritized sound. If a civilization or a species evolved in the deep ocean in the Hadal-Pelagic zone, 6,000 meters down, they would not build lighthouses. They would not use radio waves, which are absorbed by water. They would master acoustics. They would use the SOFAR channel the way we use fiber optic cables. The bloop occurred right in the sweet spot of this channel. It was a broadcast. If you wanted to send a signal to every other living thing in the Pacific Basin, you would go to that depth, and you would make that sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a transmission. This theory is unsettling because it shifts the narrative from animal to intelligence. An animal roars to scare a predator or attract a mate nearby. A transmission is designed for distance. The bloop covered 3,000 miles. That is the distance from New York to London. That is not a call. That is a network. So where are the sounds now? This is the question that keeps the archival researchers awake at night. The SOSUS network didn't go away. In fact, it got better. The sensors are more sensitive now. We have fiber optic arrays draped across the continental shelves. We have autonomous gliders patrolling the abyss. Our ability to listen to the ocean has improved by a factor of 1,000 since 1997. And yet, silence.NOAA has not released a major anomaly file like the Bloop or Julia in nearly 2 decades. Why? There are 2 possibilities. Possibility 1, the source of the sounds has died. If it was a massive biological organism, the Leviathan hypothesis, perhaps it was the last of its kind. A lonely giant, calling out into the SOFAR channel, waiting for a reply that never came. The slowdown sound of 1997 could have been the final breath. the slowing heartbeat of an ancient creature fading into extinction. The ocean is now empty of giants, and we are just listening to the ghosts of the 90s. Possibility 2. The classification protocols have changed. In the 1990s, there was a window of transparency. The Cold War ended, the military relaxed, and they shared their toys with the scientists. We got a glimpse behind the curtain. But after 9/11, after the geopolitical tension rose again, the curtain snapped shut. It is highly probable that the sounds are still there. The bloop is still happening. The train is still chugging along the Pacific Ridge. But the files are no longer being stamped anomaly biological, they are being stamped classified strategic. If the US Navy discovered that these sounds were not whales, but something else, underwater drones from a rival superpower, or unmapped geological vents that could be weaponized, or something entirely unknown to science, they would go dark. They would scrub the public feed. We know that NOAA filters the audio before releasing it to the public. They remove man-made noise to protect the privacy of naval operations. But what else falls under the definition of man-made or restricted? If a sound is too loud, too structured, or too close to a classified sector, it is deleted from the public dataset. We are listening to a censored ocean. We are left with the raw data of 1997. As some of the ocean screamed, the files sit in the archives. Digital ghosts of a time when we thought we knew our planet. We have mapped the surface of Mars better than we have mapped the floor of the Pacific. We look up at the stars, searching for signals, listening for a beep from an alien civilization. We build massive radio telescopes to catch a whisper from the galaxy, but the loudest signal ever recorded didn't come from the sky. It came from below. It came from our own basement. The file for the bloop is closed. The scientists say earthquake. The Navy says nothing, but the sensors are still running. Right now, as you listen to this, a hydrophone in the deep dark is vibrating. The needle is scratching back and forth. The tape is rolling. The ocean is holding its breath. Or perhaps, it is waiting for us to stop listening so it can speak again. The file was stamped never open, but now you know the frequency. And once you hear it, you can never unhear the silence that follows. It is often said that the Great Wall of China is the only human-made object visible from space. This is a myth. But the greatest construction project in human history isn't visible from space, nor is it visible from the ground. It is buried under 3 miles of crushing darkness. In the 1950s, the United States government authorized a project so secret, and of such massive industrial scale, that it consumed more wire, more steel, and more money than the entire Manhattan Project. They didn't build a wall, they built a nervous system, while the world looked up at the sky, waiting for Sputnik and the space race. A fleet of unmarked ships was quietly sailing into the middle of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Their mission was to lay thousands of miles of coaxial cable across the most hostile terrain on Earth, the ocean floor. They were wiring the planet to listen. The project was codenamed Caesar. The goal was to turn the entire ocean into a microphone. For 40 years, this system was a ghost unmarked on any map, unacknowledged by any president. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. Let the sound of the waves fade away. We are back inside the archive. The room is dimly lit by the green glow of a microfiche reader. The air smells of old copper and dust. On the table before us is a stack of declassified naval They are heavy, bound in grey cardboard. The paper inside is brittle, covered in the precise hand-drawn lines of mid-century engineers. You can almost hear the scratch of the drafting pencil. You can feel the cold coffee sitting on the desk of a Western Electric engineer in 1952. The atmosphere here is one of quiet, desperate calculation. There is no sunlight in this room, just the hum of the ventilation and the weight of secrets. We are looking at the blueprints for the bottom of the world. Relax your shoulders. Let the modern noise disappear. We are going back to a time when the world was analog, silent, and listening. To understand Project Caesar, we must understand the fear that built it. The year is 1949. The Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb, years ahead of American predictions. The monopoly on nuclear power is broken. The Cold War has begun, but the battlefield is not the land. The generals in the Pentagon realized that the next war would not be fought with tanks crossing the plains of Europe. It would be fought in the blind spots of the world. The United States Navy controlled the surface of the sea. They had the carriers. They had the battleships. But the Soviets had decided to go under. They were building a massive fleet of diesel-electric submarines. These vessels were quiet. They could slip out of the bases in Murmansk or Vladivostok, disappear under the ice cap, and park themselves off the coast of New York or San Francisco. They were invisible assassins. Radar cannot penetrate water. Light cannot penetrate water. Satellite imagery stops at the surface. Once a submarine submerges, it is effectively in another dimension. The US Navy was blind. They needed a way to see in the dark. And to the scientists from Bell Labs and Western Electric, these were the men who built the telephone network of America. They knew how to carry a voice across a continent. The Navy asked them a question that sounded impossible. Can you bug the ocean? The concept was theoretically possible because of the SOFAR channel. That layer of water we discussed earlier that traps sound. But knowing the theory and building the machine are two different things. To listen to the entire ocean, you cannot just drop a microphone over the side of a boat. You need an array. You need a line of hydrophones, underwater microphones stretching for hundreds of miles, linked together, processing sound in unison, and you need to plug it in. This meant laying cables, not just thin wires, but armored, heavy-duty cables capable of surviving the immense pressure of the abyss. These cables had to carry high-voltage power down to the amplifiers and carry the raw acoustic data back up to the shore stations, and they had to do it for 20 years without maintenance. You cannot send a repairman to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The scale of the engineering challenge was biblical. The ocean floor is not a flat parking lot. It is a jagged landscape of underwater mountain ranges, deep canyons, shifting tectonic plates, and volcanic vents. The engineers had to map this alien terrain using 1950s technology co-sounders and lead lines. They were drawing maps of a world no human had ever seen, just so they could lay a wire across it. The secrecy was absolute. The cover story was oceanography. The Navy claimed they were studying water temperature and whale migration. They claimed the ships were laying commercial telegraph cables for better communication with Europe. But the cables they were loading onto the ships were different. They were thicker, they were shielded, and they weren't going to landing sites in London or Paris. They were terminating at secret, windowless bunkers on remote islands. At the heart of the technology was the hydrophone itself. These weren't small devices. They were massive steel towers, some standing as tall as a two-story house, anchored to the seabed. Inside were sensitive crystals designed to pick up the slightest vibration in the water. These arrays were positioned at strategic choke points, the gaps between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, the GI-UK gap, and the deep trenches off the coast of California and Hawaii. The project required a special kind of silence. Thousands of workers at Western Electric plants in North Carolina and New Jersey were building the components. They were winding the coils, sealing the rubber gaskets, testing the pressure seals, but no single worker knew what the final machine looked like. One group built the amplifiers, another built the anchors, a third built the terminal equipment. Only a handful of men at the very top of the clearance ladder saw the full schematic. To the workers, they were just building parts for the phone company. In reality, they were building the largest listening device in the galaxy. The deployment phase began in the mid-50s. The cable ships, lumbering vessels with giant spools of wire on their decks, steamed out into the grey Atlantic. The crews worked in 12-hour shifts. The work was dangerous. The heavy cable, under tension, could snap and cut a man in half. The seas were rough, but the cable had to be paid out at a precise speed. If they went too fast, the cable would loop and kink on the bottom. If they went too slow, the tension would snap the internal wires. Day after day, night after night, the cable mile after mile of black, armored snakes sinking into the blue water, settling into the silt of the abyssal plain, waiting to be turned on while the ships were fighting the waves. Another group of men was fighting the isolation. These were the operators of the naval facilities, or UNAVs. These stations were the ears of the system. They were built in remote, often inhospitable locations. The rocky coast of Newfoundland, the wind-swept beaches of Pacific Islands, the frozen cliffs of Iceland. A NAVFAC was a strange place. From the outside it looked like a standard military base barracks, a mess hall, a perimeter fence, but the heart of the facility was the terminal building. This building had no windows. It was air-conditioned to protect the massive banks of vacuum tube computers and paper chart recorders. Inside, the air was filled with the smell of ozone and burning dust. The sound was a constant low-frequency drone. This was the sound of the ocean, amplified and played out through speakers. Imagine sitting in that room for an 8-hour shift. You are young, barely 20 years old. You have been trained to identify the sounds of the deep. You wear heavy headphones. In front of you is a rolling sheet of paper, a lophogram. A stylus burns a mark onto the paper every time it detects a frequency. Most of the time, you see noise. The ocean is loud. You see the jagged lines of surface storms. You see the chaotic scratches of commercial shipping traffic, thousands of propellers churning the water. You see the rhythmic pulses of seismic activity. But your job is to look for the needle in the haystack. You are looking for a specific frequency, a low, steady hum that doesn't belong to nature. The Soviet submarines of that era were noisy by modern standards, but in the vastness of the ocean, they were quiet enough. The operators were trained to look for blade rate, the specific frequency created by the propeller blades slicing through the water. A 5-bladed propeller spinning at 100 RPM creates a specific harmonic signature. It was a game of intense psychological pressure. If you missed a line on the paper, a nuclear-armed submarine could slip past your net and vanish toward the American coast. If you called a false alarm, you sent the entire Atlantic fleet chasing a school of whales. The operators developed a strange relationship with the ocean. They began to recognize individual whales. They gave them nicknames. They could tell when a storm was brewing thousands of miles away just by the background roar on the tape. They were the first humans to truly hear the planet breathe. But the system, Project Caesar, was designed to be passive. It only listened. It never spoke. This was its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. A passive system is undetectable. The Soviet submarines had no idea they were being tracked. They would cruise through the Atlantic, confident in their stealth, unaware that a cable miles below them was picking up the sound of their toilet flushing or a wrench dropping in the engine room. That there is a famous story from the archives of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The blockade was in full effect. Tensions were at the breaking point. Soviet submarines were trying to break the quarantine line to reach Cuba. The U.S. Navy surface ships seemed to know exactly where they were. Every time a Soviet sub tried to surface for air or snorkel to recharge batteries, a U.S. destroyer was waiting for them. The Soviet captains were baffled. They thought they had been betrayed by spies. They didn't know that the ocean floor itself was snitching on them. The SOSUS arrays were feeding real-time data to the surface fleet. The ocean had glass walls, and the Americans were the only ones looking through them. But wiring the Pacific was a different beast than the Atlantic. The Atlantic is smaller, more contained. The Pacific is vast. It is the Ring of Fire. Wiring the Pacific meant dealing with active underwater volcanoes. The engineers had to route the cables around massive subsea calderas. They had to account for landslides that could sever the line in an instant. The scale of the Pacific network was staggering. Cables ran from California to Hawaii, from Hawaii to Midway, from the Aleutians down to the deep basins of the north. It was during the Pacific expansion that the operators started hearing other things. When you build a microphone that covers a third of the planet's surface, you catch sounds you weren't looking for. The Atlantic is noisy with commerce. The Pacific is wilder. The Pacific is deeper. The operators at the Pacific Interface began to log transients, short, unidentified sounds. Some were clearly biological, vast choruses of whales singing in the deep channel, but others were harder to classify. They heard massive, low-frequency groans that lasted for hours. They heard sudden, sharp cracks that registered on sensors for 1,000 miles apart. The official manual said, geologic, tectonic plates shifting, magma moving, but the seasoned operators, the guys who had stared at the burning paper for 10 years, had their own theories. They knew the sound of rock grinding on rock. It was chaotic. Some of these new sounds were ... smooth. They had structure ... This is where the archive chill truly sets in. Imagine being alone in a bunker at 3 a.m. The coffee is cold. The rest of the base is asleep. You are staring at a stylus moving across the paper, and suddenly, a line appears. It's not a submarine. It's not a ship. It's a steady, powerful signal rising from the deep, dark trench north of Hawaii. It's too loud to be a whale. It's too organized to be an earthquake. You log it. You stamp it. You put it in a box. And you never speak of it again. Project Caesar was eventually declassified, piece by piece, as the Cold War ended and technology moved to mobile sensors. But the physical legacy remains. The cables are still there. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of miles of copper and steel, wrapped in gutta percha and polyethylene, are still lying on the bottom of the ocean. They are buried in the silt now, covered in sea anemones and deep-sea coral. The steel towers, the hydrophones, are still standing in the darkness, like silent sentinels. Some of them have been repurposed. Scientists now use the old SOSUS arrays to listen for underwater earthquakes and to track whale populations. The swords have been beaten into plowshares, but not all of them. There are sectors of the SOSUS network that were never turned over to the scientists. There are cables that run into areas of the ocean that appear blank on the maps. And there are modern versions of Project Caesar fiber optic upgrades. far more sensitive than the old copper wires that are active right now. The ocean is not just water, it is a data center. The story of Project Caesar is a reminder of the lengths humanity will go to for control. We were so afraid of a political ideology that we went to the most alien environment on our planet and filled it with wires. We turned the abyss into a surveillance state, and in doing so, we accidentally created the first planetary archive. We have 50 years of audio recordings of the deep ocean. We have the sound of the ocean before the shipping traffic became deafening. We have the voices of whale species that might now be extinct. We have the acoustic footprint of a changing planet, but the most unsettling part of the Caesar files isn't the submarines. It's the anomalies. When you go back and listen to the tapes from the 1960s and 70s, really listen, with modern digital enhancement you realize that the ocean was never silent. It is a cacophony of groans, whistles, clicks, and booms. The Navy filtered out the noise to find the signal. But for us, for the seekers of the unknown, the noise is the story. What caused the upsweep sounds recorded in August of 1991? What caused the massive sensor blind spots in the Southern Ocean? The cables know. The copper wire, sitting in the freezing dark under 400 atmospheres of pressure, felt the vibration. And picture the floor of the Pacific Ocean. It is pitch black. It is freezing. The pressure is enough to crush a car into a soda can. And running through that darkness is a long black cable. Stretching endlessly into the gloom. It is still listening. The men who built it are mostly gone. The factories that wound the wire are closed. The tube computers are in museums, but the ear is still open. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the surface of the world is quiet, something down there clears its throat. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from silence. In 1957, a fisherman off the coast of Nova Scotia reported seeing a strange, dark shape breach the water in the fog. It wasn't a whale. It was steel. It lingered for a moment, exhaling a plume of diesel smoke, and then slipped back beneath the waves without a sound. The report was filed, stamped, and immediately escalated to the highest levels of the United States Navy. They knew what it was. It was a Soviet Zulu-class submarine, carrying a nuclear payload, patrolling less than 300 miles from the American border. This was the phantom that haunted the nightmares of the Pentagon for 40 years. While the public watched the skies for bombers, the true threat was already swimming in our waters. The Soviet Union had built the largest submarine fleet in history, a red shadow designed to suffocate the Atlantic. They were invisible, they were numerous, and they were waiting for a single coded signal to unleash the apocalypse from the bottom of the sea. We didn't build the listening network to find monsters. We built it because we were being hunted. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The room changes now. The warm hum of the modern server room fades away, replaced by the colder, sharper sound of a teletype machine printing coordinates. Click, clack, click. The air here is thick with cigarette smoke and nervous energy. We are in the war room of the 1950s. The lighting is harsh, fluorescent, buzzing overhead. On the table is a map of the North Atlantic, covered in red grease pencil marks. Each mark is a potential contact. Each mark is a question mark. Imagine the tension in the shoulders of the admiral standing over that map. The coffee in the porcelain cup is cold. The phone on the desk is red, and it is silent. This is the atmosphere of the Shadow War. It is a war of waiting. It is a war of listening to the static, terrified that the static might start speaking Russian. Let us drift back to that time of grey suits and black water to understand the shadow. We must look at the architect of the shadow, Joseph Stalin. Following the end of World War II, the Soviet Union found itself in a precarious position. They had a massive land army, the Red Army, that had marched into Berlin, but they had no way to touch the United States. America was an island nation, protected by two vast oceans. The US Navy controlled the surface. Their aircraft carriers were floating cities that could project power anywhere on the globe. Stalin knew he could not compete with American aircraft carriers. They were too expensive, too complex, and took too long to build. So, he chose a different path. He chose asymmetric warfare. He looked at the success of the German U-boat, which had nearly strangled Britain into submission during the war, and he decided to scale that strategy up to a terrifying degree. Stalin ordered the construction of a submarine fleet that would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. His directive was simple: build them fast, build them strong, and fill the ocean with them. The result was the Project 613 submarine, known to NATO by the codename Whiskey. The Whiskey-class submarine was the workhorse of the Soviet Navy between 1951 and 1958. The Soviet Union built 215 of them, It remains the most numerous submarine class ever produced. Imagine that number for a moment. 215 steel Predators, slipping off the slipways in Gorky and Leningrad, one after another, like sausages from a factory. These were not the sleek, nuclear-powered vessels of the film The Hunt for Red October. These were diesel-electric boats. They were rugged, cramped, and smelled perpetually of fuel oil and unwashed men. They were designed for one purpose: coastal defense and patrol. But soon, the designs evolved. The Zulu class followed, with longer range. Then the Foxtrot. The terrifying aspect of these submarines was not their sophistication, but their stealth. A diesel-electric submarine, when running on its electric batteries, is incredibly quiet. It has no reactor pumps. It has no steam turbines. It is just a battery and a propeller. When a Whiskey-class sub moved at slow speed, it was simply a hole in the water. This was the gap that terrified American intelligence. The bomber gap, the fear that the Soviets had more planes, turned out to be a myth. The missile gap was an exaggeration. But the submarine gap was real. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Navy had more submarines than all the other navies of the world combined, and they began to venture out. They moved through the GI-UK gap, the strategic naval choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. This was the doorway to the Atlantic. If the Soviet subs could sneak through this gap, they could disperse into the open ocean. They could cut the supply lines between America and Europe. They could park off the coast of Washington, D.C. and wait. The U.S. Navy realized that their traditional methods of hunting using destroyers with active sonar pings were useless against this many targets in such a vast ocean. Active sonar reveals your location. It's like searching a dark room with a flashlight. You might see the enemy, but the enemy definitely sees you. They needed a passive system. They needed to hear the shadow before it arrived. The specific sound they were looking for was the snort. Diesel submarines have a fatal flaw. They run on batteries when submerged, but those batteries eventually die. To recharge them, the submarine must run its diesel engine. Diesel engines need air, so the submarine must come up to periscope depth and raise a snorkel, a tube that sucks in air from the surface and exhausts the engine smoke. When a submarine is snorkeling, it is vulnerable. The diesel engines are loud. The intake valve sucks air with a rhythmic, gasping sound. The exhaust bubbles create a distinct cavitation noise. This was the vulnerability the Americans decided to exploit. The entire concept of the SOSUS network project Caesar was originally calibrated to catch this specific moment of weakness. The hydrophones were tuned to the low-frequency thrum of a Soviet diesel engine breathing, that it was a game of probabilities. A Soviet sub might stay submerged and silent for 2 days, but eventually, it had to breathe, and when it did, the ocean floor would hear it. But the Soviets were not static. They were learning. They knew the Americans were listening, even if they didn't know exactly how. A deadly game of cat and mouse began to play out in the deep. The Soviet captains were aggressive. They began to test the boundaries. They would run crazy IV maneuvers, the sudden, sharp turns to check if anyone was following them in their baffles, the blind spot behind the propeller. They would hide under the thermal layers of the ocean, using the temperature difference to deflect sonar waves, and they began to carry a new weapon. In the early years, the threat was torpedoes, but by the late 50s, the threat had changed. The Soviet submarines began carrying ballistic missiles. The R-11FM was the first Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile. It had to be fired from the surface, which was dangerous, but it carried a nuclear warhead. Suddenly, a submarine wasn't just a threat to a ship, it was a threat to a city. A single Zulu-class submarine surfacing off the coast of Virginia could incinerate the Pentagon in minutes. There would be no warning, no radar blips of incoming bombers over the Arctic, just a submarine surfacing, a hatch opening, and a flash of light. This escalated the stakes of the listening game to an existential level. Every unidentified sound on the SOSUS network became a potential end-of-the-world event. The operators listening in those bunkers weren't just tracking ships. They were the first line of defense against nuclear annihilation. If they heard the distinct sound of a missile hatch blowing its ballista sound like a sharp, compressed air whoosh, they had seconds to relay the information to the Strategic Air Command. Imagine the psychological weight on those young men. A scratch on the tape, a deviation in the background noise. Was it a whale breaching? Or was it the beginning of World War III? The Atlantic Ocean is a noisy place, but the acoustics of a Soviet submarine were unique. To the trained ear, a submarine has a personality. The Whiskey-class subs were notorious for their rattle. They were mass-produced, and the quality control was not always perfect. A loose mounting bracket on a cooling pump could create a rhythmic clink-clink-clink that traveled for miles. A slightly unbalanced propeller shaft would create a beat frequency that acted like a beacon. The US Navy began to catalog these signatures. They built a library of noise. They could identify individual submarines by their flaws. Sierra 24 has a bad bearing in the starboard. Diesel Sierra 19 has a singing propeller. This level of detail allowed the US to track the movement of the entire Soviet fleet. Without them knowing, we knew when they left port. We knew when they crossed the Arctic Circle. We knew when they arrived on station. But then, the game changed again. The Soviets went nuclear. The launch of the Leninsky Nemo, the first Soviet nuclear submarine, the November class, changed the acoustic landscape. A nuclear submarine does not need to snorkel. It does not need to surface. It can stay submerged indefinitely, limited only by the amount of food on board and the sanity of the crew. However, the early Soviet nuclear subs had a problem. They were loud, incredibly loud. While the Americans had focused on silencing their machinery, mounting turbines on rubber rafts to absorb vibration, the Soviets had focused on raw power and speed. The November class was fast, but it screamed through the water. The reactor coolant pumps had to run constantly to keep the core from melting down. These pumps created a constant, high-pitched whine. The SOSUS operators called them loud trucks. When a November-class sub entered the North Atlantic, the entire sensor array lit up. It was no longer a game of hunting a ghost. It was like tracking a freight train, but this loudness created a new kind of dread. The Soviets knew their subs were loud. They knew they couldn't hide. So, they changed tactics. If they couldn't be invisible, they would be aggressive. They began to use the ocean's geography as a weapon. They would hide in the acoustic shadow of underwater canyons. They would trail American carrier battle groups, sitting directly underneath the massive, noisy aircraft carriers, using the carrier's own noise to mask their presence. This led to some of the most tense, unreported standoffs of the 20th century. Consider the case of the K-19, the infamous Widowmaker. It was a hotel-class ballistic missile submarine. It suffered a catastrophic reactor failure in the North Atlantic in 1961. The SOSUS network heard the erratic maneuvering. They heard the change in the engine rhythm as the systems failed. The US Navy knew something was wrong before the Soviet High Command did. They listened as the submarine limped home. They listened to the silence that followed. The ocean is a cruel witness. It hears the panic. It hears the mechanical failure. But the most terrifying moment for the listeners came in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. History books focus on the blockade line and the ships on the surface, but the real drama was happening below the thermocline. For Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines were sent to Cuba. Each of them was armed with a nuclear torpedo. Their orders were ambiguous. They were cut off from Moscow. They were being hunted by US destroyers, dropping practice depth charges grenades, meant to signal them to surface, but which sounded like real attacks to the terrified crews inside. The SOSUS network was overwhelmed. The Atlantic was a chaotic storm of noise. Sonar pings, exploding depth charges, the cavitation of hundreds of propellers. Deep in the archives, there are accounts of the acoustic signatures from those days. The operators describe the ocean as sounding angry. One specific event stands out. On October 27, 1962, a U.S. destroyer, the USS Beale, was tracking the Soviet submarine B-59. They dropped signaling depth charges. Inside the sub, the air conditioning had failed. The temperature was over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew was fainting from carbon dioxide poisoning. The captain, believing war had started, ordered the nuclear torpedo to be armed. The only thing that stopped the launch and the likely end of civilization was the intervention of a second officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who refused to agree. We know this story now from the history books, but consider the SOSUS operator sitting in a bunker in Bermuda at that exact moment. He would have seen the acoustic spike of the depth charges. He would have heard the frantic maneuvering of the sub. He was listening to the sound of the doomsday clock ticking down to 1 second before midnight. If that torpedo had been fired, the SOSUS operator would have been the first person on Earth to hear the start of World War III. He would have heard the launch transient, and moments later, he would have heard the implosion of the US fleet. That is the burden of the listener. You are always the first to know, and usually, helpless to stop it. The Soviet shadow eventually receded, but it never vanished. The Cold War ended, but the acoustic game simply evolved. In the 1980s, the Soviets finally solved their noise problem. Through a spy ring known as the Walker spy ring, they learned exactly how the US was tracking them. They learned about SOSUS, they learned about the blade rate frequencies and the pump noise. Armed with this stolen knowledge, they launched the Akula class. The shark, the Akula, was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. When the first Akula entered the Atlantic, the SOSUS screens remained blank. The red shadow had finally become a true ghost. This sparked a panic in the US Navy that rivaled the initial fear of the 1950s. The ocean, which had been transparent for decades, suddenly went opaque again. We could no longer guarantee that the coast was clear. This history explains why the ocean archives are so fragmented. The data from the SOSUS network is not just scientific data. It is a record of a 40-year duel. Every anomaly, every strange sound, every unidentifiable transient was viewed through the lens of paranoia. Was that a biological bloop, or was it a new Soviet countermeasure? Was that train sound a geological event, or was it a seabed crawler designed to cut the cables? The paranoia filtered the science. And this brings us back to the mystery of the modern ocean. The Soviet Union fell, the fleets rusted in the harbors of Nemo, the reactor cores were decommissioned, but the silence they left behind is deceptive. The infrastructure built to track them, the hydrophones, the cables, the bunkers, is still there, and the ocean is still hiding things. There is a theory among deep-sea researchers that the sheer volume of military noise in the ocean during the Cold War, the constant active sonar, the engine noise, the explosions, masked other, more subtle sounds. We were so loud, and so focused on listening for Russians, that we deafened ourselves to the natural anomalies of the planet. Now that the Cold War noise has quieted down, we are starting to hear the background again. We are hearing the groans of the earth. We are hearing the biological signals that don't match any known species. The Soviet shadow taught us how to listen. It forced us to wire the world. It forced us to build the machine that would eventually record the bloop. We went looking for enemies, and we found a mystery that is far older and far deeper than any political conflict. The red markers on the map are gone. The war room is empty, but the tape is still spinning. And in the silence of the post-Cold War ocean, we are left wondering if we aren't listening for them anymore. What are we listening to now? The file on the Soviet shadow is closed, but the ocean it hid within is still stamped classified. There is a moment in every classified program when the system works too well. It does exactly what it was designed to do, and the result is so terrifying that the operators wish it had failed. For the US Navy's underwater surveillance network, that moment arrived in the summer of 1997. For decades, the SOSUS network had been tuned to hear the specific, mechanical frequencies of Russian submarines. It was a filter designed to ignore the chaos of the natural world. But in 1997, the filters were removed. The network was handed over to civilian scientists, and the microphones were opened up to the full bandwidth of the Pacific Ocean. Almost immediately, the data stream became a nightmare. On May 19th, at approximately 15:30 Zulu time, the sensors didn't just pick up a sound, they were nearly overwhelmed by one. A signal appeared on the monitors that was so loud, so massive, and so inexplicably organic, that it registered on sensors separated by nearly 3,000 miles. It was a sound that made the entire Pacific Basin vibrate like a ringing bell. It wasn't a glitch, it wasn't a bomb, it was a voice, and it was coming from a coordinate where nothing exists but deep, crushed darkness. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The hum of the server room returns, steady and grounding. Here, in the digital archive, the panic of that day has been reduced to a quiet stream of data. The file we are opening is labeled NOAA Vents Program -1997. It is a heavy digital folder, filled with spectrograms, images of sound converted into light. Imagine the screen flickering in the dark room. The blue glow illuminates dust motes dancing in the air. The smell is of ozone and old electronics. You can hear the faint whir of a cooling fan. We are looking at a visual representation of the loudest sound ever recorded by nature. It looks like a scar across the graph, a jagged, rising line that defies logic. Let yourself sink into the chair. The data is cold now. It cannot hurt us. We are simply here to witness the moment the ocean broke the rules. To understand why 1997 was the year the ocean broke, we must look at the unique historical window that opened during that decade. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The great existential threat of nuclear annihilation had receded, at least temporarily. For the US Navy, this presented a problem. They had spent billions of dollars building the SOSUS network, this massive global hearing aid to track an enemy that no longer existed. The Soviet subs were rusting in port. The Atlantic and Pacific were quiet. The budget for maintaining these top-secret listening stations, was hard to justify in peacetime, but science is opportunistic. For years, oceanographers had whispered about what SOSUS could do. They knew the Navy had ears in the deep ocean, ears that could hear whales, underwater volcanoes, and seafloor spreading. They had been begging for access. In the early 1990s, the Navy finally relented. They initiated a dual-use program. They would allow cleared civilian scientists from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and NOAA to sit in the bunkers alongside the naval operators. They were given access to the raw feed, stripping away the military filters that usually scrubbed out biological noise. This was like handing an astronomer the keys to the most powerful telescope on Earth, a telescope that had been pointed at the ground for 40 years, and suddenly allowing them to point it at the stars. The scientists were ecstatic. They set up shop in the Naval Oceanographic Processing Facility in Whidbey Island, Washington. They were looking for the rumble of underwater lava. They were tracking the migration of blue whales. They were mapping the seismicity of the ocean floor, but the machine they were using was more powerful than they comprehended. Specific array that would capture the anomaly was the Equatorial Pacific Ocean Autonomous Hydrophone Array. This was a series of hydrophones moored to the seafloor, running from the east near the Galapagos Islands, stretching west across the vast, empty center of the Pacific. These hydrophones were autonomous. They weren't connected by cable to the shore in real time like the main SOSUS net. They were black boxes anchored to the bottom. They recorded sound onto hard drives, running on battery power. Every few months, a ship would have to sail out, winch them up, and swap the drives. This meant there was a time lag. The ocean would speak, but the scientists wouldn't hear it until months later, when they plugged the hard drives into their computers. Back in the lab. It was in the summer of 1997 that the researchers at the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory (PMEL) loaded the data from the May deployment. Christopher Fox, the chief scientist, was expecting the usual mix of whale calls and distant earthquakes. Instead, he found a monster. The data revealed that throughout the summer of 1997, the Pacific Ocean had been screaming. That it wasn't a continuous scream. It was a series of massive, ultra-low frequency events. The sensors, which were calibrated to detect the faint, stealthy hum of a propeller, had been hit with a wall of sound. The first thing the scientists noticed was the clipping. In audio engineering, clipping happens when a sound is so loud it exceeds the maximum limit of the microphone's ability to record. The waveform gets chopped off at the top. The hydrophones, sitting in the crushing silence of the deep, had been vibrated to their mechanical limit. Dr. Fox and his team began to triangulate. They had sensors positioned thousands of kilometers apart. By measuring the slight difference in time, milliseconds, that it took for the sound to reach each sensor, they could pinpoint the origin. The speed of sound in water is approximately 1,500 meters per second, 5 times faster than in air. The math is precise. If sensor A hears the sound at 12 hours 0 minutes and 1 second, and sensor B hears it at 12 hours 0 minutes and 5 seconds, you can draw a circle of probability. When they drew the circles for the May 19th event, the lines intersected in one of the most remote places on the planet, the deep ocean off the southern coast of Chile, west of the Drake Passage. This area is a desert. There are no tectonic fault lines that should be active. There are no underwater volcanoes known to be erupting. There are no shipping lanes. The scientists stared at a spectrogram is a visual heat map of sound. Time runs from left to right. Frequency pitch runs from bottom to top. Brighter colors mean louder sounds. An earthquake looks like a smear of noise, a sudden broadband burst of static that fades slowly. A bomb looks like a sharp vertical line, an instant pulse of energy across all frequencies. The anomaly of 1997 didn't look like rocks or explosives. It looked like a squiggle. It started at a low frequency around 10 Hz, well below the range of human hearing, and, over the course of about 1 minute, it swept upwards, rising in pitch to nearly 40 Hz. This upsweep is the characteristic signature of a vocalization. It is the shape a voice makes. When you ask a question, your voice goes up at the end. When a whale calls to its pod, its tone modulates. The 1997 anomaly was modulating. It had structure. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It wasn't chaos. It was a signal, but the scale was impossible. Let's talk about power. Let's talk about the sheer energy required to move water across an entire hemisphere. Water is heavy. It is dense. To create a sound wave that travels through water requires energy. To create a sound wave that travels for 3,000 miles, 4,800 kilometers, and is still loud enough to be clearly recorded by a hydrophone, requires an energy source that is almost nuclear in scale. The scientists calculated the source level. This is an estimation of how loud the sound was at the exact point of origin. Before it faded over distance, the calculation returned a number, roughly 215 to 220 decibels. To a layperson, that is just a number. To an acoustical engineer, that number is terrifying. The decibel scale is logarithmic. A whisper is 30 decibels, a conversation is 60 decibels. Concert is 110 decibels. Pain begins at 130 dB. A jet engine at takeoff is 1 dB. Every 10 decibels represents a tenfold increase in sound intensity. A sound of 150 decibels is not 10% louder than 140 decibels. It is 10 times more powerful. At 200 decibels, water begins to heat up. The energy is so intense that the water molecules vibrate violently. If you were swimming near the source of a 220 decibel sound, your internal organs would be liquefied instantly. The vibration would tear your cells apart. The blue whale, Balonoptera musculus, is the reigning champion of biological sound. Its calls have been measured at up to 188 decibels. It is a sound so loud it can communicate across ocean basins. But the 1997 anomaly was significantly louder than a blue whale. It was not just a bit louder, it was orders of magnitude more powerful. If this was an animal, our understanding of biology is fundamentally broken. The blue whale grows to 100 feet long. It needs that size to support the massive air sacs and resonance chambers required to produce a 188 decibel call. To produce a 220 decibel call with the same biological mechanism, an organism would need to be proportional. It would need to be ... Colossal. Calculations suggest a creature size of anywhere from 250 to 300 feet, 75 to 90 meters. That is the size of the Statue of Liberty. This brings us to the breaking of the sensors. The system wasn't designed for this. The SOSUS analysts were trained to look for the signatures of known threats. They had a catalog. A Soviet sub sounds like this. A humpback whale sounds like this. An underwater volcano sounds like this. The 1997 anomaly didn't fit in the box. It broke the classification system. The scientists at NOAA checked the military logs. Was there a secret weapons test? Was the Navy detonating new depth charges? The logs were clean. No exercises in the South Pacific. No missing submarines. Then they checked the geological records. Was there an icequake? This became the leading theory. Ice is loud. When a massive iceberg calves off the Antarctic shelf and scrapes along the ocean floor, it shudders, it grows. The friction of millions of tons of ice against rock can create massive sound waves, but the icequake theory has holes. It is a comfortable blanket used to cover up a frightening shape. Icequakes are usually broadband. They create noise across a wide range of frequencies. They are scratchy. They lack the pure, tonal quality of the 1997 sound. The Bloop, as it was later nicknamed, had a narrow frequency band. It was a clean note. Furthermore, icequakes usually happen near the ice. The triangulation point for the anomaly was in the deep ocean, thousands of miles from the Antarctic shelf. While icebergs do drift, the likelihood of an iceberg grounding and creating that specific, voice-like upsweep at that exact location is statistically incredibly low. And then, there was the repetition. It didn't happen just once. Throughout the summer of 1997, the sensors picked up variations of this signal. It was as if something had woken up. The data from that summer shows a pattern of activity. The ocean was alive in a way it hadn't been before. The sensors were recording biological transients that were off the charts. Dr. Fox and his team were scientists. They were rigorous. They published papers. They eventually leaned towards the ice calving explanation because, in science, you must choose the most plausible theory, even if it doesn't fit perfectly. You cannot write sea monster in a peer-reviewed journal, but in interviews, the hesitation was there. The admission that the sound profile was unusual, that it mimicked biology too perfectly. The sensors were broken in a metaphorical sense. They had captured a truth that science couldn't process. They had recorded a ghost. What happened after 1997? This is where the story shifts from scientific curiosity to archival mystery. The anomaly of May 19th became a legend. It leaked to the internet. It became the Bloop. It inspired movies and horror stories. But what about the data stream? The NOAA events program continued. The hydrophones are still down there. The technology has improved. We now have digital sensors with higher fidelity, capable of recording terabytes of audio. But since that summer in 1997, there has been no public announcement of a signal of that magnitude. Did the ice stop breaking? Did the glaciers suddenly become silent? If the bloop was just an iceberg scraping the bottom, we should hear it every year. The Antarctic ice shelf is melting faster than ever. The ocean should be a cacophony of bloops, but it isn't. The 1997 anomaly stands alone in the archives. It is a singular event, a spike in the timeline. This leads to the quiet dread that permeates the modern archive. There are two possibilities, and both are unsettling. The first possibility is that the event was biological, and the creature has died. Perhaps we heard the last call of a species that had lived in the abyss for millions of years, hidden by the silence of the deep, only to be discovered in its final moments. We turned on the microphones just in time to hear it say goodbye. The second possibility is that the creature is still there, but the filters have been put back on. Remember, the SOSUS network is still a military asset. NOAA uses it by permission of the US Navy. The data is screened. There is a protocol known as sanitization. Before audio data is released to the public or even to uncleared scientists, it passes through a security filter. If the Navy determined that the 1997 anomaly was not ice, but something else, something strategic, or something threatening, or something that revealed the capabilities of their new sensor upgrades, they would simply delete it from the public feed. We might be living in a world where the ocean is screaming every day, but our speakers are on mute. The bloop might not be an anomaly. It might be the background noise of the deep, a noise that we are no longer allowed to hear. The file from 1997 remains the only glimpse we have behind the curtain. It is a reminder of how little we know. We sit on the surface of a planet that is 70% water, staring at our phones, while beneath us, in the crushing dark, something massive is moving, crying out with a voice that can crack a sensor. 3,000 miles away, the ink on the 1997 report is faded. The hard drives from that summer are sitting in a storage locker in Newport, Oregon. But the sound is immortal. It is a frequency that, once heard, resonates in the back of your mind forever. The sensors didn't break. They worked perfectly. They told us the truth. We just weren't ready to believe it. Sound is invisible. It is a vibration of air or water, a fleeting moment of energy that disappears as soon as it is created. But in the world of classified surveillance, sound leaves a physical mark. It can be captured, frozen, and turned into an image. This image is called a spectrogram. It is the fingerprint of a noise. When the analysts at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration opened the file from May 1997, they didn't just hear the anomaly, they saw it. On the glowing monitors of the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, the bloop appeared as a scar of bright, intense color against a background of black static. It was a visual impossibility. Most underwater sounds are chaotic ragged bursts of noise that look like scribbles, but this was elegant. It was a perfect, sweeping curve that rose from the depths of the frequency chart like a rising sun. It had geometry. It had intent. It was the visual proof that something massive had moved in the darkness, leaving a signature that no known geological process could forge. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The room is dark, lit only by the cathode ray tubes of the 1990s monitors. The hum of the cooling fans is the only sound here. The air is still, smelling faintly of heated plastic and ozone. We are sitting in the chair of an acoustical engineer. The coffee cup on the desk has gone cold hours ago. On the screen in front of us is a waterfall display. It is a scrolling image of the ocean's memory. The background is a deep, digital blue, representing the silence. Scattered across it are faint green speckles, the background noise of waves and distant ships. But in the center of the screen, there is a shape that demands attention. It is bright red and orange, indicating raw power. It is the bloop, frozen in time. Trace the line with your eyes. It is smooth. It is organic. It is waiting for us to decode it. To understand why this image terrified the experts, we must first understand how to read a This is the primary tool of the hydroacoustic trade. It converts 3 dimensions of data into a single 2D image. The horizontal axis, running from left to right, represents time. The vertical axis, running from bottom to top, represents frequency, the pitch of the sound. Low notes are at the bottom, high notes are at the top. The third dimension is color. The color represents intensity, or volume. On the systems used by NOAA in 1997, silence was black or dark blue, quiet sounds were green, loud sounds were yellow, and the loudest, most violent sounds were red. When a submarine explodes or implodes, like the tragedy of the USS Scorpion, the spectrogram looks like a vertical tear. It is a sharp line that hits all frequencies at once, a broadband impulse. It is chaotic and instant, that when an earthquake happens, the spectrogram looks like a smear. It is a messy, horizontal blob of noise that rumbles on for minutes, lacking any distinct shape. It looks like a cloud of dust on the screen. But the bloop was different. If you look at the archived image, the one that has been shared on conspiracy forums and scientific journals alike, you see a distinct shape. It starts at the bottom left and curves up to the top right. This is what acousticians call a frequency upsweep. The sound began at roughly 10 Hz. This is an ultra-low frequency. For context, the lowest note on a standard piano is about 27 Hz. The lowest sound a human ear can hear is 20 Hz. The bloop started so deep in the bass register that you would not hear it. You would only feel it as a pressure wave in your chest. Over the course of approximately 1 minute, the sound swept upward. It rose from 10 Hz to nearly 40 Hz. This curve is the smoking gun of the biological theory. Why? Because non-living things rarely change their pitch in a smooth, controlled curve. Think about a rock falling off a cliff, crash, it doesn't sing. Think about a tectonic plate, shifting rumble, it doesn't carry a tune, but living things do. When a wolf howls, the pitch rises and falls. When a whale sings, it modulates the air in its massive lungs to change the frequency. This modulation is a sign of a controlled mechanism. It implies that the source of the sound was changing its shape, or changing the tension of a membrane, to alter the pitch. In the analysis of the bloop spectrum, the smoothness of the line is what is so unsettling. There are no jagged edges. There are no interruptions. It is a continuous fluid motion. The scientists at NOAA, led by Dr. Christopher Fox, stared at this curve and realized they were looking at a biological transient. In plain English, that means a creature passing by. But the visual analysis revealed another detail that deepened the mystery: the timescale. Most biological sounds are short. A blue whale call typically lasts for 10 to 30 seconds. A human shout lasts for a second. The bloop lasted for over 1 minute. On the spectrogram, it is a long stretched-out event. To produce a continuous high-volume sound for 60 full seconds requires an immense capacity for air or water displacement. If you try to shout for 60 seconds without taking a breath, you will fail. A blue whale can do it, but even they pause. The bloop was a sustained release of energy. Visually, on the monitor, it dominates the screen. The surrounding noise of the ocean, the green speckles of currents and distant storms, fades into insignificance next to the bright, red-hot intensity of the anomaly. The spectrogram also tells us about the distance. The image we usually see is clean. The lines are sharp. This indicates that the signal-to-noise ratio was incredibly high. Despite traveling 3,000 miles through the crushing depths, the signal arrived at the sensors with its structure intact. This is where the SOFAR channel visualization comes into play. The spectrogram shows that the sound was trapped perfectly in that sound-carrying layer of the ocean. It didn't scatter. It didn't bounce off the surface and get distorted. It beamed straight through the channel like a laser. This suggests the source was located at the optimal depth, roughly 1,000 meters down. This is the deep scattering layer, a zone of the ocean filled with squid, fish, and gelatinous creatures that migrate up and down every day. The spectrogram places the bloop squarely in the home of the giant squid and the sperm whale, but the image on the screen dwarfs them both. To truly appreciate the anomaly, we must place it side by side with known sounds. The archive is full of reference files. Let's pull up the spectrogram of a blue whale. Visually, a blue whale song looks like a series of dashes and pulses. It has a rhythmic quality: pulse, pause, pause, pause. It often has harmonics, faint echo lines above the main sound. It looks like a code. The bloop does not look like a code. It looks like a singular statement. It lacks the complex harmonic structure of a whale song. It is simpler, yet more powerful. Now let's pull up the spectrogram of a volcanic eruption. The Pacific is the ring of fire. Underwater volcanoes are constantly erupting. On the screen, a volcano looks like a chaotic, broadband explosion. It is messy. It fills the entire frequency range with static. It looks like a splatter of paint. The bloop is not a splatter. It is a brush stroke. It is confined to that specific 10 to 40 Hz narrow band. This rules out an explosive volcanic event. Now, let's look at the official explanation: the icequake. NOAA eventually classified the bloop as an icequake. Specifically, they compared it to data recorded in 2005 of ice breaking off the Antarctic shelf. On a spectrogram, an icequake does show some similarities. When a massive piece of ice cracks and rubs against the sea floor, it can create a groan that varies in pitch. It can create a tremor. But if you look closely at the comparative images, and amateur analysts have been doing this for 20 years, the match is not perfect. The icequake spectrograms are sketchier. They show friction. They show the jagged resistance of solid matter grinding against solid matter. The Bloop spectrogram is terrifyingly smooth. It looks wet. It looks liquid. This visual discrepancy is what keeps the mystery alive. In forensic audio, smoothness usually equates to biology. Friction creates jagged lines. Fluid dynamics and biological resonance create smooth curves. The eye detects what the ear might miss. The eye sees the fluidity of the bloop and instinctively recognizes it as organic. There is another visual clue in the data: the dispersion. As sound travels through the ocean, different frequencies travel at slightly different speeds. Over thousands of miles, the sound smears out. The spectrogram of the bloop shows very little dispersion. This confirms the calculations about the source location. It was far away, yes, but the purity of the signal suggests it originated from a single, coherent point source. It wasn't a field of noise, like a storm. It was a point, a single dot on the map that generated enough energy to light up sensors across half the globe. Let's discuss the color intensity again. On the vintage NOAA software, the color scale was calibrated to the expected noise floor of the ocean. The ocean is naturally quiet in the ultra-low frequencies. The bloop hit the sensors so hard that it saturated the color scale. In the raw data files, there are moments where the digital values peak at the maximum integer the software could handle. This is the digital equivalent of a microphone blowing out. Imagine a creature, or a machine, or a phenomenon, that is so loud it blinds the surveillance equipment, designed to hear nuclear warheads. The visual analysis also reveals what is missing. There is no precursor sound. In geological events, you often see small tremors before the main quake. In mechanical events, like a submarine starting its engine, you see a startup transient. The bloop simply ... begins. It rises out of the silence, executes its 60-second curve, and then vanishes back into the black. There is no aftershock. There is no echo. It implies a deliberate action. A creature opening its mouth, vocalizing, and then closing it. Or a machine turning on, transmitting, and turning off. The isolation of the image is what makes it so haunting. It sits there on the timeline of 1997 like a monolith. Before it, silence. After it, silence. It stands alone. The spectrogram of the bloop has become a piece of modern art. It is printed on t-shirts. It is the thumbnail for thousands of videos. But we must remember that this image is not art. It is a measurement of reality. Someone, or something, created that curve. When we look at this spectrogram, we are looking at a shadow cast by an unknown object. We can measure the shadow's length 60 seconds and its darkness 220 decibels, but we cannot see the object itself. The analysis of the frequency band into 40 Hz is particularly interesting when we consider the deep sound channel again. This frequency range is the sweet spot for long-distance communication in water. High-pitched sounds are absorbed quickly by water. Low-pitched sounds travel forever. If you were designing a communication system for a planet covered in water, you would use exactly this frequency. If you were an organism evolving to signal a mate across 5,000 miles of ocean, you would evolve a voice box that produced exactly this frequency. The bloop fits the physics of the ocean too perfectly. It is an optimal sound. This optimization is what unsettles the Tier 1 researchers. Nature is often messy. Evolution is a series of good enough adaptations, but the bloop was mathematically perfect for the environment it was in. Could it have been a machine? The smoothness of the curve could be artificial. A variable frequency drive on a massive underwater turbine could, theoretically, produce a sweeping tone. But we return to the volume, 220 decibels. We do not have machines that are that loud. Active sonar, the loudest sound humanity makes in the ocean, tops out around 235 decibels, but it is a sharp, distinct ping. It doesn't sweep for 60 seconds. If the bloop was a machine, it was a machine larger and more powerful than anything. In the public inventory of any navy on Earth, the spectrogram leaves us with a paradox. It looks biological, but it is too loud to be an animal. It looks mechanical in its precision, but it is too organic in its modulation. It looks geological in its power, but it is too smooth to be a rock. That it occupies a category of one, and this is why the file remains a source of obsession. In the archive of the world's sounds, we have a label for everything. We have a folder for whales. We have a folder for earthquakes. We have a folder for ships. The bloop sits in the folder marked unknown, and every time an analyst opens that folder and looks at that red, sweeping curve, they are forced to confront the fact that our classification system is incomplete. The monitor flickers. The green speckles of the background noise continue to scroll. Somewhere in that static, Right now, the curve might be appearing again. But remember what we discussed in the previous file. The filters. If the spectrogram appeared today, would we see it? Or would the algorithms scrub it out as a glitch before it ever reached a human eye? The 1997 spectrogram might be the last honest image of the ocean we ever got. It is a portrait of a monster, drawn in sound waves, hanging in the gallery of the deep. We can measure the pixels, we can calculate the hertz, we can debate the decibels, but the image remains silent. It shows us everything, and it tells us nothing. The curve rises, the curve falls, and the ocean keeps its secrets. It is human nature to fear the unknown, and it is also human nature to try and categorize it. When the bloop was first recorded in 1997, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief when the initial theories pointed to a biological source. We wanted it to be a whale. A whale is safe. A whale is majestic. A whale is a known variable in the equation of the ocean, but in the quiet rooms of the Naval Oceanographic Office, the math didn't add up. The file on the blue whale Balaenoptera musculosus extensivi. We know its length. We know its weight. We know exactly how much air its lungs can hold. And when you take the laws of physics and apply them to the sound recorded in 1997, the whale theory begins to crumble. The creature required to make that sound would need a heart the size of a car and a resonance chamber larger than a cathedral. The data suggests that if this was a biological entity, it was not a whale. It was something that biology says should not exist. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The hum of the server room fades, replaced by the slow, rhythmic beating of a massive heart. Thump 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 thump. We are visualizing the anatomy of a giant. The air is cold here, smelling of salt and preservation fluid. We are standing in a virtual laboratory, looking at the skeletal schematic of a blue whale suspended in the dark. That is a beautiful machine of bone and blubber, evolved over 50 million years to rule the ocean. But as we look closer at the data, as we overlay the spectrogram of the bloop onto the anatomy of the whale, the edges don't align, the pieces don't fit. The ink on the report is faded, but the numbers are stubborn. Let us dissect the impossible. Let us strip away the comforting lie and look at the raw biology of the deep. To understand why the blue whale theory collapses, we must first appreciate the blue whale itself. It is the largest animal known to have ever lived on Earth. It is larger than It is larger than the biggest dinosaurs, the Titanes. A mature blue whale can reach 100 feet in length and weigh 200 tons. Its tongue weighs as much as an elephant. Its heart weighs as much as an automobile. Its blood vessels are wide enough for a human to swim through. It is a masterpiece of biological engineering, and it is loud. The call of a blue whale is the gold standard for underwater acoustics. At 188 decibels, it can communicate with other whales across hundreds of miles of ocean. But 188 decibels is not 220 decibels. This is where the scaling law comes into play. In physics, sound is energy. To produce a louder sound, you need more energy. But the relationship is not linear, it is logarithmic. To increase the volume of a sound by just 3 decibels, you need to double the power. The bloop was estimated at roughly 220 decibels. That is a difference of 32 decibels from the loudest known blue whale call. Let's do the math. If you need to double the power every 3 decibels, then a 32 decibel gap represents a power increase of more than 1,000 times. To suggest that a blue whale made the bloop is like suggesting that a standard house cat roared with the volume of a lion. It is physically impossible for the organism to generate that much pressure. Sound in a biological creature is produced by moving air. A whale takes a breath at the surface, dives, and then moves that air back and forth between air sacs near its level. It uses the air to vibrate U-folds of tissue similar to our vocal cords. The sound resonates within the whale's body, using the skull and the melon, a fatty organ in the forehead, to project the wave into the water. The volume of the sound is limited by the volume of air the whale can hold. It is a pneumatic system. You cannot get more energy out than you put in. For a creature to produce the 2 decibel bloop, it would need a lung capacity that defies our understanding of vertebrate biology. It would need air sacs that are enormous, perhaps 3 to 4 times the size of a blue whale's entire respiratory system. This brings us to the Leviathan calculation. If we assume the creature follows the same biological proportions as a whale, we assume it has lungs, a heart, and a larynx, then we can estimate its size based on the sound it produced. If a 100-foot whale produces 188 decibels, then the creature that produces 220 decibels would need to be roughly 250 to 300 feet long. That is nearly the length of a football field. There is nothing in the fossil record that approaches this size. The largest ichthyosaurs were maybe 70 feet. The megalodon was 60 feet. The blue whale is the ceiling. Biology has limits. Gravity has limits. Even in the water, a creature that size would struggle to pump blood to its brain. It would struggle to find enough food to sustain its metabolism. So, if it was a whale, it was a mutant, a hyper whale, an anomaly so large that it would show up on satellite imagery when it surfaced to breathe. And that is the second problem with the blue whale theory, the breath. Whales are mammals. They are tied to the surface. A blue whale can hold its breath for maybe 90 minutes, max. Usually, it's much less, 20 to 30 minutes. If there was a population of 300-foot hyper whales swimming in the South Pacific, we would see them. We would see their blow. The spray from a blue whale's blowhole shoots 30 feet into the air. The spray from a 300-foot creature would look like a geyser. It would be visible from commercial airliner. It would be picked up by weather satellites. Yet, the ocean off the coast of Chile where the bloop originated is empty. There are no reports of There are no sightings of backs as wide as islands. Breaking the surface, the creature heard in 1997 didn't seem to need air. The sound came from the deep, stayed in the deep, and the source remained in the deep. This pushes the blue whale theory from unlikely to impossible. Let's look deeper into the sound itself. It's not just about loudness. It's about the signature. Every species has a dialect. Blue whales are consistent. Their calls are usually long, moaning pulses that stay at a constant frequency for 10 to 20 seconds, often followed by a short upsweep or downsweep. They repeat these calls in patterns. It is a song. The bloop was a singular, rapid upsweep. It went from 10 Hz to 40 Hz in about 1 minute. While this looks biological, as we discussed in the previous file, it does not look like a Balanoptera call. Blue whales do not typically sweep across that wide of a range that quickly. Their voices are drones. They are the monks of the ocean, chanting on a single note. The bloop was more dynamic. It had a portamento quality, a slide. Some researchers tried to argue that it might be a fin whale. Fin whales are faster, sharper, but fin whales are smaller than blue whales. The volume problem remains. Others suggested a sperm whale. Sperm whales are the loudest toothed whales. They use clicks, echolocation that can be incredibly intense. They use these clicks to stun giant squid, but a click is a fraction of a second. The bloop was 60 seconds of continuous tonal shifts. A sperm whale cannot hold a note. It clicks. It doesn't sing. So, we have ruled out the baleen whales, too quiet, wrong pattern. We have ruled out the toothed whales, wrong sound type. What is left? This is where the Tier 1 archival researchers get uncomfortable. Because if you rule out the mammals, you are left with the invertebrates. Could it be a squid? We know the giant squid Architeuthis dux exists. We know the colossal squid exists. These are massive creatures, growing up to 40 or 50 feet. They live in the deep. They don't need to surface for air. But there is one major problem. Squids have no voice. Squids have no vocal cords. They have no air sacs. They are made of water and muscle. They communicate with color changes on their skin. They are silent hunters. For a squid to make a sound, it would have to be mechanical grinding its beak, or expelling water through its siphon. But a beak grind is a scratch, not a tone. And a water jet is a whoosh, not a hum. Unless ... There is a species of cephalopod that has evolved a resonance chamber. A species that has developed a way to vibrate its mantle to create low-frequency waves. This is pure speculation, but it fits the alien nature of the bloop, a massive, soft-bodied creature hiding in the deep scattering layer, vibrating its entire body to signal in the dark. Because it has no bones, it can grow larger than a whale. Water supports its weight. It doesn't need to surface, so we never see it. But if such a creature exists, it rewrites the textbooks of marine biology. The collapse of the blue whale theory leaves a vacuum. And in science, vacuums are dangerous. If we cannot explain it with the animals we know, we are forced to consider the animals we don't. The bloop occurred in 1997. In the decades since, we have tagged thousands of blue whales. We have attached suction cup microphones to their backs. We have recorded millions of hours of their songs. Not once, not a single time has a blue whale ever produced a sound that matches the bloop. The data is conclusive. The king of the ocean is not the king of noise. There is a pretender to the throne. Let's talk about location. Geography is just as important as biology. Blue whales are migratory. They follow the food. They follow the krill. They move between the feeding grounds in the polar regions and the breeding grounds in the tropics. Their highways are well mapped. The bloop originated at approximately 50 S100 W. This location is significant. It is roughly 1,700 kilometers, 1,000 miles from the coast of Chile. It is in the middle of the South Pacific Gyre. Oceanographers call this area an oceanic desert. The currents here rotate in a massive, slow circle. The water is neutral. There is very little plankton. Therefore, there is very little krill. Therefore, there are very few whales. Blue whales do not hang out in the middle of the desert. They have no reason to be there. It is a biological wasteland. So why was the loudest sound in history recorded in a place where nothing is supposed to live? This geographical anomaly is often overlooked, but it is the final nail in the coffin for the blue whale theory. If it was a whale, it was a whale that was lost. A whale that was thousands of miles from its food source. And it wasn't just a sound. As we discussed, the sensors picked up activity throughout that summer. Whatever it was resident there. It didn't just pass through. It stayed in the wasteland. That suggests that the creature doesn't eat krill. It eats something else. Something that lives in the deep abyssal plane of the gyre. The collapse of the blue whale theory forces us to look at the alternative, the non-biological theory. If it's not an animal, is it the Earth itself? We return to the icequake, but as we established in the spectrogram analysis, the icequake doesn't fit the curved art, so, is it a machine? In 1997, did a submarine, perhaps a prototype, a drone, a secret project, go to that coordinate and test a new sonar system? If it was a machine, it solves the volume problem. We can build machines louder than whales. We can build transducers that vibrate at 220 decibels. But why there? And why that sound? A sonar ping is designed to be crisp. It bounces back. The bloop was a moan. It was a frequency sweep. If it was a machine, it was a machine designed to mimic biology. Was it a decoy? During the Cold War, both the US and the Soviets experimented with acoustic camouflage. They built devices that emitted fake whale sounds to mask the noise of their submarines. Could the bloop have been a malfunction of a massive acoustic decoy? A doomsday decoy left over from the Cold War, sitting on the bottom of the Pacific, its batteries slowly dying, letting out one final, distorted, amplified groan before shutting down forever. It is a chilling thought. A dead machine screaming in the dark, but the most unsettling theory, one that keeps the archive chill. True to its name, is the possibility that our understanding of animal is too narrow. We assume that because we haven't seen it. It doesn't exist. But we have explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the South Pacific Gyre. The blue whale is the largest animal we have caught. It is the largest animal we have measured. But the ocean is a 3D environment. It has depth, and in the deep, the rules of size change. Architeuthis giant squid was a myth until we found a carcass. The coelacanth was extinct for 65 million years until a fisherman caught one in 1938. The megamouth shark was unknown until 1976. The ocean is good at hiding giants. When the blue whale theory collapses, it leaves us with a terrifying reality. We are sharing this planet with something that can scream louder than a jet engine, and we have no idea what it is, where it is, or if it is watching us. The file labeled blue whale has been put back in the cabinet. It doesn't fit. The folder on the desk is now empty. It is waiting for a name. The silence of the blue whale researchers is telling. They know the numbers. They know the decibels. And they know that on May 19, 1997, something else was swimming in the deep. The king is dead. Long live the ... unknown. The sensors are still listening. The ocean is still deep, and somewhere, in the dark water west of Chile, the source of the sound might still be drifting, waiting for the summer to return. The file was stamped never open, but the sound has already escaped. There is a point on the surface of this planet where you are entirely alone. If you were to sail to these specific coordinates in the South Pacific, the nearest human beings to you would not be in Chile, or New Zealand, or Antarctica. The nearest humans would be the astronauts aboard the International Space Station, orbiting 250 miles above your head. This coordinate is known as the oceanic pole of inaccessibility. It is the furthest point from land in any direction. It is a place of absolute, crushing isolation. It is a biological desert where the currents rotate in a slow, dead circle. It has no shipping lanes. It has no islands. It has no name on most maps. But in the classified archives of the space agencies, it is known as Point Nemo, and it was Herat, the precise center of emptiness. But the triangulation lines of the 1997 anomaly intersected. The loudest sound ever recorded in the ocean did not come from the busy coastlines or the biologically rich coral reefs. It came from the dead zone. It came from the one place on Earth where nothing is supposed to exist. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The hum of the server room feels louder now, because we are imagining a place where there is no sound at all. Let the walls of the room dissolve. We are drifting over a grey, heaving ocean. The sky is a flat, featureless white. The water is a deep, bruised purple. The temperature is just above freezing. There is no wind. There are no birds. The albatross does not fly this far. The ink on the map we are holding is faded, marking a spot at 48 degrees 52 minutes south, 123 degrees 23 minutes west. The paper feels damp. The cursor on the monitor blinks over the empty blue expanse. We are hovering over the grave of satellites and the birthplace of monsters. This is Point Nemo. Take a breath. It is a long way back to shore. To understand the terror of the location, we must first understand the math that defines it. Point Nemo is not a physical landmark. You cannot stand on it. It is a geometric concept calculated in 1992 by a Croatian-Canadian survey engineer named Hervoge Luca Taylor. Luca Taylor wasn't looking for monsters. He was writing a computer program to calculate the point of inaccessibility. This is a geodesic puzzle. He had to find the single coordinate on the globe that was equidistant from 3 nearest coastlines. He fed the data into his Hipparchus software. The computer crunched the numbers of the Earth's ellipsoid shape and spat out a coordinate in the south Pacific Gyre, the 3 points of land closest. 2 Point Nemo, Ducie Island part of the Pitcairn Islands to the north. Motu Nui part of Easter Island to the northeast. Mar Island part of Antarctica to the south. Each of these desolate scraps of land is exactly 2,688 kilometers, 1,670 miles away. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the distance from London to Moscow. If you are floating at Point Nemo, you are at the center of a circle of water that is 3 million square miles in size. In this circle, there is nothing. The ocean floor is roughly 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet down. It is a flat, featureless, abyssal plain. The water itself is unique here. It is the center of the South Pacific Gyre, a massive rotating current that effectively blocks nutrients from entering. Without nutrients, there is no Without phytoplankton, there is no Without zooplankton, there are no fish. Without fish, there are no sharks, no dolphins, and no whales. It is the least biologically active region of the world ocean. The water is incredibly clear, a piercing violet blue, because there is practically no life to cloud it. It is a wet desert. So, when the NOAA scientists in 1997 drew their triangulation lines for the Bloop, and the lines crossed right here, the mystery deepened. If the Bloop was a biological caller, request for a mate or a signal of aggression, why would the creature be here? A blue whale would starve to death in the South Pacific Gyre. A predator would find no prey. It implies that whatever generated the sound does not rely on the surface ecosystem. It implies a creature of the deep biosphere, something that lives on the bottom, perhaps feeding on the marine snow, the dead organic matter that drifts down from the surface, or perhaps feeding on chemical energy from thermal vents that haven't been mapped yet. But there is another reason why this location is significant, a reason that is purely human and purely industrial. While biology avoids Point Nemo, humanity has found a use for it, because it is so remote, so empty, and so far from any shipping lane or flight path. The space agencies of the world, NASA, Roscosmos, ESA, JXA, have designated it as the spacecraft cemetery. When a satellite reaches the end of its life, or when a space station needs to be decommissioned, you cannot just leave it in orbit. It becomes dangerous space junk. You have to deorbit it. You have to crash it. But you can't crash a flaming pile of titanium and hydrazine just anywhere. You might hit a city. You might hit a ship. The flight dynamics officers in Houston and Moscow aim for Point Nemo since 1971. Nearly 300 spacecraft have been buried here. The most famous resident is Mir, the massive Soviet space station. In 2001, Mir was guided into the atmosphere. It broke apart into glowing meteors, screaming across the sky, and slammed into the ocean at Point Nemo. 140 tons of Russian metal, computers, and history sank into the dark. Alongside Mir, there are dozens of Progress supply ships. There are spy satellites. There are rocket stages. And in the future, around 2030, the International Space Station itself, the size of a football field, will be targeted to crash here. This creates a haunting image for the archive. The bottom of the ocean at Point Nemo is not just mud. It is a graveyard of high technology. Twisted solar panels, shattered pressure vessels, and silent antennas are scattered across the abyssal plain, resting in the eternal dark. This brings us to a Tier 1 theory regarding the BLOOP, Could the sound have been an impact? If a massive piece of space debris failed to burn up and hit the water at terminal velocity, would it create an ultra-low frequency sound? The scientists checked the logs. The bloop occurred in the summer of 1997. Was there a re-entry scheduled? The records showed that while Point Nemo is the target, space debris re-entry is a chaotic event. Not every crash is announced. There are classified satellites, black projects that might be deorbiting secretly. However, the acoustics don't match. An impact is a splash. It is a percussion event. It creates a shockwave. As we established in the spectrogram analysis, the bloop was a slow rise. It was a 60-second groan. Debris hitting the water happens in a split second. Even if a massive station hit the water, it wouldn't sing for a minute, so the spacecraft cemetery theory, while atmospheric and eerie, doesn't explain the sound, but it adds a layer of irony to the mystery. We chose this spot to dump our trash because we thought it was empty. We treated it like a landfill because we believed no one was watching. But if the biological theory is true, we have been bombing the roof of a giant's house for 50 years. There is a coincidence regarding Point Nemo that is so precise it makes even the most skeptical researcher pause. It involves a writer who died decades before the acoustic sensors were ever invented. H.P. Lovecraft, the American horror writer, is famous for his stories about Cthulhu, a massive, ancient cosmic entity that lies sleeping in a sunken city called R'lyeh. In his 1928 story, The Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft gives the specific coordinates for this nightmare city. He writes that LAI is located at 479 S12643 W. Now, look at the coordinates of Point Nemo, 4852 S, 12323 W. They are dangerously close. The distance between Lovecraft's fictional city of monsters and the real-world pole of inaccessibility is less than 200 miles. In the scale of the Pacific Ocean, they are effectively the same place. Lovecraft wrote his story in 1928. The bloop was recorded in 1997. Point Nemo was calculated in 1992. How did a writer in the 1920s, who had no satellites, no sonar, and no knowledge of the South Pacific Gyre, pinpoint the most isolated spot on Earth as the home of a submerged monster? A skeptic would say it's a coincidence. Lovecraft wanted a remote location for his story, so he looked at a globe and picked the emptiest spot he could find. It makes sense that the emptiest spot on a 1920s map would align with the emptiest spot calculated by a 1990s computer. But for the retention of our Tier 1 audience, consider the implications. Lovecraft described Cthulhu as a creature that communicates through dreams and telepathy, a creature whose voice is felt globally. The bloop was a sound that traveled globally. It was a sound that baffled science, and it came from the exact neighborhood of our single quotes. This coincidence has fueled the quiet dread of the oceanographic community. It is a reminder that our scientific discoveries often echo our oldest myths. We mapped the silence, and we found that the silence had a location. Let's return to the triangulation data. The triangle of silence. The sensors used to pinpoint the bloop were not just in the Pacific. There were listening stations in the Atlantic as well, but the Atlantic sensors heard nothing. The sound was blocked by the continent of South America. This confirmed the Pacific origin. But within the Pacific, the sound was omnidirectional. It radiated out in a perfect circle. This suggests that the source was not shrouded by underwater mountains. It was out in the open. The bathymetry, the underwater topography of Point Nemo is largely flat, but there are features. There are fracture zones. Specifically, the Eltonine fracture zone to the south. This is a massive scar in the Earth's crust where tectonic plates are grinding past each other. If the sound was geologically massive gas release, or a mud volcano, it would likely come from one of these fracture zones. But the triangulation didn't point to the fracture zone. It pointed to the basin, the flat, mud-covered basin. This is the smoking gun of the anomaly. If a sound comes from a fault line, it's an earthquake. If a sound comes from a volcano, it's an eruption. If a sound comes from the middle of a mudflat, where there is no geological activity, what is it? It implies something moving across the flat. Imagine the environment down there. The pressure is 400 atmospheres. That is 6,000 pounds per square inch. It would crush a human instantly. It would crush a standard submarine. The only things that survive down there are adapted to the crushing weight. They are made of water. They are gelatinous, fluid-filled, and slow. Life in the abyss is usually slow because energy is scarce. You don't sprint in the desert, you drift. But the bloop was a burst of high energy. It implies a creature with a massive metabolic reserve. A creature that could afford to scream. Why would a creature in the dark, where there are no other creatures, need to scream? Perhaps it wasn't calling to another creature. Perhaps it was echolocating. If the bloop was a sonar ping from a biological entity, the size of the ping determines the size of the picture it sees. Bats use high-frequency clicks to see moths. Sperm whales use loud clicks to see squid. A low-frequency upsweep like the bloop, traveling for 3,000 miles, would be an echolocation pulse designed to map the entire ocean basin. It would be a creature trying to see the boundaries of its world, a creature sending out a pulse to see if there is anyone else out there, and the silence that followed tells us the answer. It heard nothing back. Today, Point Nemo remains the loneliest place on Earth. The sailors in the ocean raced around the world. Yacht race past close to it. They describe an eerie feeling. The wind is steady, the waves are massive, but the water feels dead. There are no birds following the boats. The astronauts on the ISS look down as they pass over. They see only blue, a vast, unblinking eye of water that the sensors are still recording. The hydrophones of the International Monitoring System, IMS, set up to detect nuclear tests, have stations throughout the Pacific. They are listening for the infrasound of explosions. But, since 1997, the bloop has not repeated at that magnitude. There have been other sounds. Julia, train, but none had the raw, terrifying power of the original. Did the source move? Did the source die? Or did the source go back to sleep? The spacecraft cemetery continues to grow. Every few years, another satellite screams out of the sky and plunges into the water at Point Nemo. The debris field expands. If there is something down there, we are slowly burying it in our history. We are covering the anomalous zone with layers of aluminum and gold foil. The archive at NOAA contains the coordinates. 50 is a cienta, doblu. It is a set of numbers that defines the unknown. For the American, Tier 1 audience, this is the ultimate locked room mystery. We have the weapon, we have the location, but we have no suspect. But we are left with the image of a place that is hostile to all life, yet produced the greatest sign of life we have ever encountered. It forces us to reconsider what inhabited means. We think the Earth is ours. We have mapped the continent. We have named the islands. We have drawn lines across the maps. But the Pacific Ocean is a planet of its own. Point Nemo is its capital, and we are not welcome there. When you look at a map of the world, find that empty space between New Zealand and Chile. It looks like a blank page. It looks like the cartographer forgot to draw something, but it isn't blank. It is full of noise, it is full of wrecks, and it is full of secrets. The triangulation is complete. The lines have crossed. We know where to look. We just don't have the courage to go down there and knock on the door, because if Lovecraft was right, and if the spectrograms are right, something might answer. In the history of surveillance, silence is often louder than noise. We are conditioned to look for the evidence, the smoking gun, the fingerprint, the voice on the tape. But in the world of classified archives, the truth is rarely found in what remains. It is found in what has been removed. There is a specific phenomenon known as the gap. It famously occurred during the Watergate scandal, with the 18.5-minute gap on President Nixon's tapes. But the ocean has its own gaps. In the timeline of the US Navy's acoustic monitoring, there are moments where the reel simply stops. There are time codes that jump forward. There are logs where the ink is blacked out, and the magnetic tape has been demagnetized to pure static. The most chilling example occurred in 1968, during the search for a lost nuclear submarine. The SOSUS network was listening. It heard the death of the vessel, but in the declassified timeline released decades later, independent analysts noticed a discrepancy. There is a window of time approximately 14 minutes before the final catastrophe, where the acoustic record is strangely pristine, or, according to some, deliberately erased. What happened in those 14 minutes? The file was stamped "never open," yet we begin tonight. The air in the room is heavy with the smell of vinegar. This is the scent of vinegar syndrome, the chemical decay of old acetate magnetic tape. We are deep in the physical archives now. The digital screens are gone. We are surrounded by shelves of aluminum canisters, stacked floor to ceiling, containing the raw audio history of the Cold War. Imagine taking a reel of Tunch quad tape out of its box. It is heavy. The edges are sharp. You thread it onto a massive reel-to-reel machine. The tension arm engages. The capstan starts to spin, work-lick. The tape moves across the playback head at 15 inches per second. You are watching time physically move from the supply reel to the take-up reel. It is a linear record of reality. But if you look closely at the tape, you can see the splices, the diagonal cuts where a razor blade severed the timeline. and a piece of adhesive tape joined it back together. Someone was here before us. Someone edited the ocean. To understand the significance of the missing time, we must return to May 22, 1968. The USS Scorpion SSN 589, a skipjack-class nuclear submarine, was transiting the Atlantic Ocean, returning to Norfolk, Virginia, from a deployment in the Mediterranean. It was a routine transit. The weather was fair. The crew of 99 men was looking forward to coming home, but at midnight, the Scorpion missed a scheduled radio check. By the morning of May 27th, the Navy declared a massive search and rescue operation. They scoured the surface of the ocean for oil slicks or debris. They found nothing. The Atlantic is vast, and searching for a sunken submarine is like searching for a needle in a haystack, if the haystack was 3 miles deep and pitch black. But there was a man named John Craven, the Navy's chief scientist for special projects. He knew they didn't need to look with their eyes. They needed to look with their ears. Craven went to the SOSUS archives. He knew that if the submarine had imploded, the pressure hull had collapsed at depth. It would have created a massive acoustic event, a sound loud enough to ring across the entire Atlantic basin. He pulled the tapes from the listening stations in the Canary Islands and Newfoundland. He was looking for a specific signature, the bubble pulse. When a submarine implodes, the air inside the hull is instantly compressed by the ocean water. It creates a bubble of high-pressure air that expands and collapses, rhythmically as it sinks. Boom dash whoosh dash boom dash whoosh. It is a morbid heartbeat. Craven found it. On the tapes, buried in the noise, was a series of catastrophic sounds. By triangulating the time delay between the sensors, he pinpointed a location near the Azores. He drew a circle on the map, measuring just a few miles wide. 5 months later, they lowered a camera sled into the dark, and exactly where Craven said it would be, lying in a field of debris at 10,000 feet, was the twisted hull of the Scorpion. It was a triumph of acoustic forensics. It proved that the ocean hears everything, but the story didn't end there. In the years that followed, as portions of the investigation were declassified, a troubling narrative emerged regarding the cause of the implosion. The official Navy inquiry concluded that a torpedo battery had likely exploded, or a hot-run torpedo had detonated inside the tube. It was ruled an accident, a mechanical failure. However, acoustic analysts who have studied the visualized data of those tapes point to a strange sequence of events leading up to the implosion. The implosion itself is clear. It is a violent high-energy event, but the tapes record the ocean environment for hours before that. In the official timeline, the Scorpion is transiting quietly. Then, suddenly, catastrophe, but in the shadow. Logs the notes made by the original SOSUS operators. There are references to other sounds in the vicinity, sounds that occurred roughly 20 minutes before the death of the sub. This is where the 14-minute gap theory originates. According to researchers of naval history, the tape segment immediately preceding the first explosion shows signs of sanitization. On a magnetic tape, silence has a noise floor. Even when nothing is being recorded, there is a faint hiss sound of the magnetic particles moving over the head. It is a warm, organic static dot, but if a section of tape is erased, if it is passed over a strong magnet to wipe the data, the hiss changes. It becomes a dead silence. Or, if the section is physically cut out and the remaining ends spliced together, the timecode jumps. The allegation is that the tapes from the Canary Island station have a discontinuity. The background noise shifts. The rhythm of the ocean, the distant waves, the biological chatter changes abruptly, as if the listener has been teleported forward in time. What could happen in 14 minutes that requires erasure? There are two prevailing theories in the Tier 1 conspiracy community, and both are terrifying. Theory 1 is geopolitical. The Scorpion was not alone. In 1968, the Cold War was hot. Soviet submarines were constantly trailing American vessels. We know that a Soviet Echo 2 class submarine was operating in the vicinity of the Scorpion's track. Did the hydrophones pick up the sound of a collision? Did they pick up the distinct high-frequency whine of a Soviet torpedo entering the water? If the Scorpion was sunk by the Soviets, the US government would have been faced with a choice: admit it and start World War III, or bury the evidence and call it an accident. If the tapes contained the acoustic signature of a Soviet torpedo door opening, that 14 minutes of audio would be the most dangerous recording in history. It would have to be erased. But there is theory 2. The theory that aligns with the archive chill. The Scorpion was operating in deep water near the mid-Atlantic ridge. This is a zone of intense geological and, perhaps biological mystery. The intruder sound described by some anonymous sources was not a propeller. It was not a machine. It was a transient similar to the Bloop. but sharper, closer. Some speculate that the Scorpion encountered a massive biological anomaly, a creature that reacted to the active sonar of the submarine. If the tapes recorded the sound of something attacking the hull, something that groaned, or shrieked, or struck the steel with organic force that would shatter the Navy's understanding of the ocean, a mechanical failure is tragic. A Soviet attack is political, but a biological attack by an unknown species is existential. The 14 minutes of missing tape might contain the sound of the crew fighting against something that wasn't supposed to be there. Let's step back from the speculation and look at the mechanics of the cover-up. How do you erase the ocean? In 1968, data wasn't a file on a hard drive. You couldn't just highlight it and press delete. Data was rust. Magnetic tape is essentially a strip of plastic coated in ferric oxide. The recording head magnetizes these particles into patterns. To edit a tape, you had two options. Option A, the bulk eraser. This is a powerful electromagnet. You pass the reel over it, and it scrambles the particles back into randomness. It wipes everything. The problem with this method is that it leaves a hole in the background noise. If you are listening to the hum of the ocean, and suddenly the hum vanishes into perfect artificial silence for 14 minutes, anyone listening will know it was tampered with. It's too obvious. Option B, the splice bist is a surgical method. You find the section you want to remove. You mark the start and the end with a grease pencil. You place the tape in a splicing block, a metal groove that holds it in place. You take a razor blade and cut the tape at a 45-degree angle. You remove the offending 14 minutes. Then, you pull the two remaining ends together and tape them on the back. The problem with splicing is the timecode. The SOSUS tapes had a time signal running on a separate tracker, precise atomic clock pulse. If you cut out 14 minutes, the clock jumps. 11:45 p.m. becomes 11:59 p.m. in a split second. To hide a splice, you have to be a master. You have to fake the timecode. You have to record a new time signal over the cut, but you can't fake the background. The ocean is a dynamic system. The ambient noise changes over time. A storm passing overhead creates a specific sound profile. A school of fish creates another. If you cut 14 minutes out, the background ambience might shift drastically. It's like cutting a scene in a movie where it's raining, and splicing it to a scene where it's sunny. The discontinuity is jarring. Acoustic forensics experts look for these phase shifts. They look for the moment the rain stops instantly. In the case of the naval logs, the sanitized files often have loops of background noise inserted to fill the gaps. Imagine the editor found a 30-second clip of safe ocean noise, just quiet water. They would loop that clip over and over again to fill the 14 minutes. To the untrained ear, it sounds like silence, but to a computer or a Tier 1 analyst, the repetition is obvious. Nature doesn't repeat itself perfectly. If you see the exact same wave pattern appear every 30 seconds, you are looking at a fake. You are looking at wallpaper pasted over a hole in the wall. The missing 14 minutes of the Scorpion tapes are suspected to be exactly this: acoustic wallpaper, a looped recording of nothing designed to hide something. This practice didn't end in 1968. It became protocol. We must understand that the SOSUS network is a military asset. Its primary purpose is national security. Science is a secondary luxury. There is a classification guide known as the Security Classification Guide for Ocean Surveillance. It dictates what sounds are secret. Obviously, the sound of us submarines is secret. The sound of enemy submarines is secret. But there is a third category, anomalous acoustics, that reveals sensor capabilities. If a biological sound like the bloop is so loud that it registers on sensors 3,000 miles away, acknowledging it reveals the range of the sensors. If the Navy admits, "We heard a squid in Chile from a bunker in Washington," they are telling the Russians, "We can hear your submarines in Chile from Washington." Therefore, the anomaly must be erased, not because of the monster, but because of the math. The monster proves the range. This leads to the paranoia regarding the 1997 Bloop data. We heard the bloop, it was released, but did we hear all of it? The bloop recording available to the public is sped up. It is processed. It is a snippet. Is there a longer version? Is there a version where the sound continues? Is there a version where the sound changes? Some researchers believe that the bloop was just the beginning of a much longer event, that the creature or machine for hours, but only the most ambiguous ice-like segment was released to NOAA. The rest, the parts that sounded too much like a language, or too much like a weapon, were fed into the bulk eraser. In the analog era, erasing history required a razor blade. It left a physical scar on the tape. You could find the splice if you looked hard enough. Today, in the digital era, Erasing history is seamless. The modern SOSUS network and the civilian hydrophone erase feed data directly into massive server farms. The data is born digital. Algorithms process the audio before a human ever hears it. These algorithms are designed to clean the signal. They use adaptive noise cancellation. They remove the hum of shipping. They remove the static of rain. But who writes the code for what constitutes noise? If an algorithm is programmed to remove unknown transient anomalies, then the bloop of 2025 will never be heard. It will be deleted by the software as a glitch. It will be scrubbed from the file in real time. The operator will sit in the room, drinking their coffee, staring at a flat line on the screen, while beneath the ocean, a leviathan screams. The computer decides what is real. This is the ultimate dread of the archive, the fear that the missing 14 minutes has become the missing decade. We might be living in an era of total acoustic censorship. We know that the US Navy still maintains the integrated undersea surveillance system, i.e., we know they have deployed new mobile sensors. We know they are listening harder than ever, but the public discoveries have stopped. No new bloops, no new Julias. Just silence. Is the ocean getting quieter, or are the filters getting better? There is a rumor, persistent Tier 1 whisper about a file known as the Black Logs. These are the raw, unfiltered recordings from the SOSUS network, stored on air-gapped servers, untouched by the sanitization algorithms. In these logs, the ocean is a cacophony. In these logs, the 14 minutes of the Scorpion tape are intact. In these logs, the source of the bloop is identified, but to access them, you would need a clearance that doesn't exist. You would need to bypass the safeguards of a system designed to protect the world from the truth. The missing 14 minutes is not just about a submarine. It is a symbol of the gap between what is happening and what we are allowed to know. We are standing on the shore, looking at a calm surface. But underneath, the tape has been cut, the splice is hidden, and the story we are told is a loop of white noise, playing over and over again, to drown out the sound of the things that live in the dark. The ink has faded, the tape is brittle, but the cut remains. And every time you see a glitch in a video, or hear a dropout in an audio file, ask yourself, did the signal fail? Or did someone press the mute button? If the bloop was the ocean screaming, then the sound known as Julia was the ocean whispering a name. In the archives of classified acoustics, there is a dangerous assumption that the 1997 bloop was an isolated event, a singular freak of nature that never repeated. This is false. The hydrophones of the NOAA events program didn't stop recording after the summer of 1997. They kept listening. And what they heard in the years that followed suggests that the deep ocean is not empty, but crowded. On March 1, 1999, the sensors in the equatorial Pacific picked up a sound that was far more disturbing than a monster's roar. It was a sound that mimicked the human voice. It was soft, it was melodic, and it was loud enough to be heard from 1,000 miles away. They labeled the file Julia. It sits in the database alongside another anomaly recorded in the Ross Sea. A mechanical, grinding rhythm known simply as the train. These files prove that the abyss has a vocabulary. One sounds like a woman cooing in the dark. The other sounds like a massive engine idling on the sea floor. Both of them were stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The only sound now is the quiet hum of the server room. The air conditioning cycles on and off, a rhythmic breath of cold air that keeps the machines from overheating. We are back at the terminal. The screen is flickering with the refresh rate of an old CRT monitor. The file folder we are opening is grainy, the digital icon pixelated. There is a sense of voyeurism here. We are about to listen to something that wasn't meant for human ears. The timestamps on these files are from the late 90s, a time of dial-up internet and beige computers. But the sounds contained within them are timeless. They are ancient. Imagine the cursor hovering over the play button. The spectrum analyzer is black and silent, waiting for the data to load. The room feels smaller now. The shadows in the corner feel deeper. Let's play the tape. The anomaly known as Julia was recorded on March 1, 1999. The location was the East Equatorial Pacific, a vast stretch of open water west of Peru and Ecuador. Unlike the bloop, which was a minute-long rising groan, Julia was short. It lasted for approximately 15 seconds. But in those 15 seconds, it managed to trigger a primal psychological response in the analysts who heard it. This is a phenomenon known as pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to find patterns where none exist. We see faces in clouds. We hear voices in the wind. When the acoustic engineers played back the Julia file, they didn't hear a geological grind. They heard a coo. The sound has a wavering sing-song quality. It rises and falls in pitch. but it does so gently. It sounds remarkably like a person, specifically a woman making a soothing noise. Oh 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 dash who oh 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 dash who oh 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 dot. The terror of Julia lies in its volume. The source of the sound was triangulated to a point in the deep ocean, far from any land. For a sound to be recorded by the autonomous hydrophone array at that clarity, the source level had to be massive. If a human were to make that sound, they would need lungs the size of a hot air balloon. The official explanation from NOAA is consistent with their previous findings. Iceberg grounding. The theory is that a large iceberg had drifted north from Antarctica. When it ran aground on a seamount or scraped against the ocean floor, the friction created a stick-slip vibration. Think of running a wet finger around the rim of a crystal wine glass. It sings, it creates a pure tone. The scientists argue that Julia was essentially a mountain of ice playing a wine glass made of rock, that it is a plausible theory. Physics allows for it, but the geography makes it complicated. The sound was recorded in the equatorial Pacific. This is the tropics. While icebergs do drift, they melt. For an iceberg to be large enough to ground on the seafloor and create a sound audible for 3,000 miles, it would have to be a macabre. To find a macabre floating near the equator is an anomaly in itself. It would be like finding a glacier in the Sahara. And then there is the uncanny valley of the sound. Ice friction is usually it has high-frequency harmonics. It sounds like nails on a chalkboard. Julia is hollow. It is breathy. It lacks the sharp, scratching edges of rock and ice. This has led the Tier 1 researchers to speculate on the biological possibilities. If the bloop was a call of aggression or power, Julia sounds like a call of communication. In nature, animals use different tones for different purposes. A lion roars to claim territory. A lioness purrs to calm her cubs. Could Julia be the contact call of a massive species? The frequency range of Julia is slightly higher than the bloop, which fits the biological model of sexual dimorphism. In many species, the female has a higher pitched call than the male. If we accept the possibility that the bloop was a male of an unknown species, then Julia fits the profile of the female. The timing is also interesting. The bloop was 1997, Julia was 1999. 2 years later, if these were animals, perhaps they are migratory. Perhaps they only vocalize during a breeding cycle that happens once every few years. The silence in between isn't emptiness. It's just the long wait of a species that lives on a geologic timescale. The name Julia itself adds to the myth. It wasn't named Anomaly 54b. It was given a human name. This suggests that the analysts felt a personality in the sound. They personified it. They looked at the spectrogram, heard the mournful, lonely cry from the deep, and they thought, she sounds like a Julia. It is a testament to the power of sound. A rock scraping on the bottom of the world became a ghost girl haunting the hydrophones, and to this day, listening to the sped-up recording gives listeners goosebumps. It sounds like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of water, calling out from a place where no voice should exist. If Julia is the ghost, then the train is the machine. Recorded on March 5, 1997, the same year of the sound as the bloop. This anomaly is distinct because it doesn't sound like biology at all. It sounds exactly like its name. The recording comes from the Ross Sea, near Antarctica. When you look at the spectrogram of the train, it looks like a barcode. It is a series of steady, rhythmic pulses. Chug ... chug ... chug ... chug ... It mimics the sound of a massive freight train moving over tracks. It has a constant tempo. It doesn't speed up. It doesn't slow down. It doesn't waver like a biological call. It is metronomic. The official explanation. Iceberg grounding. Again, the theory is that a tabular iceberg was dragging its keel along the sediment. As it dragged, it would get stuck, pressure would build, and then it would jump forward, thud, stuck, thud, stuck, thud, dud. This stick-slip motion could, in theory, create a rhythmic pounding sound. But anyone who has heard a train knows that the sound is complex. It's not just a thud, it's a metallic grinding, it's a resonance. The train sound recorded by NOAA has a mechanical resonance. It sounds like machinery. This has fueled one of the most persistent theories in the dark archive, the deep-sea mining theory. We know that the ocean floor is rich in rare earth metals, manganese, nodules, gold, cobalt. We know that superpowers have been eyeing these resources for decades. Could the train be the sound of a covert industrial operation? Imagine a massive, autonomous crawler, the size of an office building, moving across the darkness of the Ross Sea floor. It is strip mining the seabed. It has no crew. It is new. It churns through the mud, crushing rock, filtering out the gold, and leaving a trail of destruction behind it. such a machine would be classified. It would be illegal under international treaties protecting Antarctica. It would have to operate in total secrecy. The sound of the train fits this profile perfectly. It is the sound of heavy industry operating in a void. The location, the Ross Sea, is one of the most remote and protected ecosystems on Earth. If you wanted to test a secret mining drone, or a seabed crawler, that is exactly where you would go. It is far from shipping lanes. It is under the ice shelf. No satellites can see what is happening underwater. Only the hydrophones can hear it. The train sound raises a different kind of horror than the bloop. The bloop suggests we are not alone because of monsters. The train suggests we are not alone because of us. It suggests that even the most remote, pristine wilderness on the planet has already been invaded by the industrial machine, that there is no silence left, that even at the bottom of the world, under miles of ice, there is a bulldozer running. The sound is relentless. In the raw audio files, it goes on for minutes. Chug ... chug ... chug. It implies a force that cannot be stopped. An iceberg eventually melts or floats away. A whale eventually needs to breathe. But a machine can run forever. The spectrogram of the train shows distinct bands of frequency. This indicates a complex source. It's not just a single impact. It has harmonics. Machinery creates harmonics, the vibration of metal parts resonating with each other. If it is nature, nature is doing a perfect impression of a diesel engine. When you view Julia and Train together with Bloop and slow down, a picture begins to emerge. The ocean of the late 90s was a cacophony. It wasn't just one anomaly. It was a chorus. On one side of the Pacific, you have the biological screams, the Bloop and Julia, the male and the female, the monster and the ghost. On the other side, near the pole, you have the mechanical drones, the train, the machine. The NOAA scientists, stripped of their military filters, were suddenly hearing the reality of the planet. And the reality is that the planet is loud. We tend to think of the deep ocean as the silent world. Jacques Cousteau coined that phrase, but he was wrong. The deep ocean is an acoustic chamber. It is a gallery of whispers, groans, shrieks, and rumbles. The Julia sound reminds us that the ocean can be eerie. It can sound human. It can trick our brains into thinking there is a person down there. It taps into the myth of the siren, the voice that lures sailors to their doom. The train sound reminds us that the ocean is physical. It is rock and ice and metal. It is a place of immense crushing force. The fact that these sounds were all recorded within a few years of each other, 1997 to 1999's the final puzzle piece. Why then? Why did the ocean wake up in the late 90s? Was it climate change? Was the ice shelf beginning to crack, creating a symphony of friction that we misinterpreted as monsters? Or was it simply that we started listening? Maybe Julia has been singing for 1,000,000 years. Maybe the train has been chugging since the last ice age. We just didn't have the microphones to hear them. The archives of NOAA contain terabytes of data. Most of it is labeled wind waves, some of it is seismic. But the folder marked unidentified is the one that keeps growing. Every time a hydrophone picks up a sound that doesn't fit the algorithm, it gets dumped in the bin. How many Julias are in that bin? How many times has the train run since 1997? We don't know, because after 1999, the public reports of these named anomalies stopped. The golden age of acoustic discovery ended. The curtain was pulled back down, but the sounds didn't stop. Physics doesn't stop. Somewhere in the equatorial Pacific, the source of Julia is still drifting. Somewhere in the Ross Sea, the train is still grinding. And tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that silence is an illusion. The air in your room is silent. The street outside might be silent, but beneath the waves, the conversation continues. The ghosts are cooing, the machines are running, and the archives are listening. In the intelligence community, ambiguity is dangerous. An unidentified signal on a radar screen could be a flock of birds, or it could be a nuclear first strike. The job of the analyst is to make a binary choice. Is it nature or is it a weapon? When the Bloop and its sister anomalies appeared in the late 90s, the US government was faced with a terrifying dichotomy. On one side of the table sat the biologists arguing for a creature of impossible size. On the other side sat the naval strategists, arguing for a Soviet doomsday machine of impossible power. The debate that raged behind closed doors was not about science. It was about survival. If the sound was biological, we were dealing with a monster. If the sound was mechanical, we were dealing with a secret war. The file on this internal conflict is filled with redacted arguments, contradictory memos, and fear. The conclusion they reached was never made public, perhaps because they realized that neither answer offered any comfort. The file was stamped, never open. Yet we begin tonight. The room is the walls are lined with acoustic foam, absorbing the hum of the ventilation. We are deep inside the Pentagon, or perhaps a bunker in Maryland. The lighting is artificial, harsh, and buzzing. Imagine a long mahogany table covered in charts. On one side, the gray suits of the Pentagon. On the other, the tweed jackets of academia. The air smells of stale coffee and heated arguments. The only sound is the rustle of paper confidential memos being shuffled back and forth. The ink on these pages is black, heavy, and definitive. We are here to witness the moment where logic hit a wall. Relax, let the tension of the room wash over you. We are flies on the wall of history. To understand the military's position, we must look at the geopolitical context of 1997. The Cold War was officially over, but the machinery of the Cold War was still active. The Soviet Union had collapsed, but its secrets had not disappeared. They had merely been sold, lost, or buried. When the Navy first heard the bloop, their instinct wasn't Godzilla. Their instinct was Ivan. The naval analysts pointed to the volume, 220 decibel. As we discussed, biology struggles to reach this volume, but technology does not. The US Navy uses a system called SOSUS, LFA Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System Low Frequency Active. It is a sonar system designed to find quiet diesel submarines. It blasts the ocean with low-frequency sound waves. The source level of LFA sonar can exceed 230 decibels. If the US can build a machine that loud, the Russians can too. The theory proposed by the mechanical camp was that the bloop was a test of a new Russian sleeper weapon. Rumors had circulated for years about a Soviet project known as later confirmed as the Poseidon drone. This was a concept for an autonomous, nuclear-powered underwater drone, armed with a 100-megaton warhead, designed to sit on the ocean floor for years, waiting for a signal to detonate and create a radioactive tsunami. The analysts looked at the bloop's location, Point Nemo, the most remote place on Earth. If you were going to test the communication system for a doomsday drone, a ping to wake it up or put it to sleep, you would do it there. You would do it when no one was watching. The frequency low long range was perfect for communicating with a buried asset. The profile and upsweep could be a coded handshake protocol, a modem connecting. The Julia sound, appearing 2 years later, was viewed not as a ghost, but as a secondary test, a different frequency, a different channel. For the military strategists, the mechanical theory was terrifying, but it was logical. It fit the behavior of a superpower trying to maintain leverage in a unipolar world. They argued that the organic nature of the sound, the wobble, the curve, was intentional camouflage. If you build a weapon to hide in the ocean, you don't make it sound like a machine. You make it sound like a whale. You disguise the acoustic signature so that the enemy dismisses it as just biology. This is known as acoustic mimicry. The military argued that the bloop was the ultimate stealth technology, a machine wearing the voice of a monster. Across the table, the biologists from NOAA shook their heads. They held up the They pointed to the curves. Machines don't breathe, they argued. The primary defense of the biological theory was the imperfection. Machines are precise. A crystal oscillator vibrates at an exact frequency. A turbine spins at a specific RPM. Even when a machine fails, it fails mathematically. It creates harmonics. It creates a beat frequency. The bloop was fluid. It had jitter and bioacoustics. Jitter refers to the microfluctuations in pitch that occur because organic tissue is soft. A vocal cord is not a steel wire. It is wet, mucus-covered tissue. When air passes over it, it flutters. The spectrogram of the bloop showed jitter. It showed the chaotic, subtle texture of life. The biologists argued that, to engineer a machine that perfectly replicated the chaotic physics of a giant larynx was harder than just building the machine itself. Why would the Russians spend billions developing a perfectly organic decoy sound, only to make it 220 decibels loud, so loud that it drew the attention of the entire world? It defeats the purpose of stealth. If it was a machine, it was a badly designed one. If it was an animal, it was a masterpiece. They also pointed to the non-repetition. A machine testing a signal usually repeats it. Test, adjust, test, adjust. The bloop happened. It varied slightly over the summer, and then it stopped. This behavior mimics migration. It mimics a season. It mimics the life cycle of an organism that wakes, breeds, and sleeps. The biologists proposed the gigantism theory. They cited deep-sea gigantism, a known phenomenon where invertebrates in the deep ocean grow to massive sizes due to the cold temperatures and lack of predators. Think of the giant isopod or the colossal squid. They argued that in the unexplored abyssal plains of the South Pacific, a species of soft-bodied cephalopod perhaps related to the octopus could have evolved to immense size. Since it has no skeleton, it leaves no fossils. Since it lives at 4,000 meters, it is never seen. They argued that the bloop was not a roar, but a resonance. Perhaps this creature doesn't use air. Perhaps it stridulates rubbing body parts together or vibrates a fluid-filled sac. The sheer volume, they admitted, was a problem. But biology is full of surprises. The pistol shrimp can create a sound loud enough to break glass just by snapping its claw. Size isn't the only factor. Mechanism matters. The debate hit a stalemate. The military couldn't prove it was a weapon without going down there to find it, which was impossible at that depth. The biologists couldn't prove it was an animal without a specimen, which didn't exist. So a third theory emerged. The hybrid theory. In the silence of the archive, the most unsettling files are the ones that suggest we are asking the wrong question. It isn't biological or mechanical. What if it is both? The Cold War saw the rise of biospheres. The US Navy has a marine mammal program. They train dolphins and sea lions to detect mines. In the 1960s, the CIA launched Project Acoustic Kitty, trying to implant listening devices into cats. We know that research was done on modifying animals for surveillance. The classified debate contains a fringe theory. The cyborg leviathan. Could the bloop be the result of a biological organism that has been tampered with? Imagine a large whale, or a similar creature, implanted with a low-frequency transponder, or a creature that has been genetically modified or acoustically amplified by human experimentation, then lost. It sounds like science fiction, but in the paranoia of the black budget world, the lines between nature and engineering blur. Or consider the unintended consequence. Perhaps the bloop was a natural creature reacting to a mechanical trigger. Maybe the Navy turned on a secret, ultra-high-power sonar array, a machine, and the sound we heard, the bloop, was the death scream of a massive, unknown species being liquefied by the sonic pressure. In this scenario, the machine caused a biological sound. We didn't record a monster, we recorded a murder. The outcome of the debate was silence. The government did not send a fleet to Point Nemo. They did not evacuate the coast of Chile. They simply categorized the file as unknown, possible icequake, and released the sanitized version to the public. Why? Because the unknown is a strategic asset. If the Russians think we have a monster, let them be afraid. If the public thinks it's just ice, let them sleep. Certainty causes panic. Ambiguity maintains control. The classified debate ended not with a handshake, but with a shrug. The admiral went back to his war games. The scientist went back to his data, and the ocean went back to being a dark room where anything could be hiding. Today, when you listen to the bloop, you are conducting the debate yourself. Your brain wants it to be an animal. It feels lonely. It feels sad. But your gut fears it is a machine. It feels cold. It feels powerful. The truth is likely drifting somewhere in between. A biology we don't understand, or a technology we can't admit to. Either way, something massive is moving through the deep, and it doesn't care about our classifications. It only cares that we are listening. In the world of intelligence, there is a strategy known as a limited hangout. When a secret becomes too big to hide, you don't suppress it. You release a fragment of it. You give the public a small, fascinating piece of the truth to distract them from the terrifying whole. The story of the bloop is not just about a sound. It is about a specific moment in time when the US government decided to open the vault. For years, the acoustic data from the SOSUS network and the autonomous hydrophone arrays was locked away, labeled as classified military intelligence. But in the early 2000s, something changed. A decision was made to declassify specific audio files, the bloop, Julia, the train. They were uploaded to a public government website. They were given catchy names. They were presented as scientific curiosities. But why? Why would an organization obsessed with secrecy suddenly share its anomalies with the world? The leading theory among archival researchers is that the files were scrubbed before they were shared. The audio we heard was processed, sped up, and filtered. We were given the remix, not the master tape. We were given the anomaly, but the context was erased. The file was stamped, never open. Yet we begin tonight. The soundscape shifts from the deep ocean to the quiet hum of a dial-up modem connecting in the night. ERDing. It is the sound of the early internet. The year is 2002. The monitor is bulky, emitting a soft static charge against your fingertips. We are navigating to a .gov website. The page is simple plain text, blue hyperlinks, a white background. This is the digital archive of the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory. It feels sterile. It feels safe. But behind every blue link labeled spectrogram or audio file, there is a raw dataset that sits on a secure server in a windowless room, cold to the touch. The ink on the physical logs has faded, but the digital footprint remains. We are about to click on the link that changed the world's perception of the ocean. The declassification of the Bloop was a masterclass in controlling the narrative. When NOAA released the audio file to the public, it came with a crucial caveat that most people missed. The speed. The raw sound of the Bloop is ultra-low frequency. It vibrates at around 10 to 40 Hz. This is below the threshold of human hearing. If you were to play the original real-time recording, you wouldn't hear anything. You might feel a pressure in your ears, or a subtle vibration in the floorboards, but the room would seem silent. To make it audible to the public, the NOAA engineers sped up the recording. Specifically, they increased the speed by 16 times. This is a standard scientific practice for visualization, but it dramatically alters the perception of the event. When you speed up a sound, you raise its pitch. The slow rolling groan of the earth becomes a sharp, distinct bloop. It sounds like a bubble bursting. It sounds small. It sounds harmless. By speeding it up, the archive inadvertently or perhaps intentionally disguised the sheer scale of the event. In real time, the sound was a slow-motion roar that lasted for over a minute. It was a deep, resonant event that shook the ocean for miles. But the 16x version sounds like a drop of water in a bathtub. This manipulation allowed the sound to go viral. It became a ringtone. It became a meme. It was stripped of its terror. The Tier 1 audience, the ones who read the technical footnotes, realized that the public was listening to a caricature of the truth. The release also included Julia and the train. These files were also processed. The background noise, the ambient floor was cleaned up. This cleaning process is where the skepticism lies. In audio forensics, the background noise tells you the environment. It tells you if there were other ships nearby. It tells you the sea state. By removing the noise to isolate the anomaly, the archivists removed the context. Did the raw tape of Julia contain the sound of a submarine engine in the background? Did the raw tape of the train contain the echo of active sonar pinging off the source? We will never know, because the files released to the public were sanitized for clarity. Then came the pivot. For years, the NOAA website listed these sounds under the category of unidentified. The mystery was allowed to breathe. It generated interest in oceanography. It secured funding, but around 2012, the narrative shifted. The unidentified label was quietly removed. The official explanation was updated to icequakes. The timing of this reclassification is suspicious to those who track the archive. It coincided with a renewed interest in deep-sea mining and the expansion of the U.S. Navy's underwater drone program. Suddenly, the monsters were gone. The mystery was solved. The official line became, "It was just ice. Nothing to see here." But the data hadn't changed. The spectrograms were the same. The physics of the blue whale collapse hadn't changed. The only thing that changed was the policy. This is the essence of the declassification event. It wasn't a release of truth. It was a management of curiosity. By giving the public an answer, even a flawed one like icequakes, the government closed the case file. They stopped the questions. What was not declassified is just as important as what was. Every digital file has metadata. In a military or scientific context, this metadata includes the precise coordinates of the sensor, the exact depth, the water temperature, and the time down to the millisecond. The public files were stripped of this granular data. We know the general location 50S100W, but we don't know the specific sensor ID. We don't know which hydrophone heard it first. This prevents independent researchers from triangulating the sound themselves to verify NOAA's claims. We are forced to trust the official map. Furthermore, there is the issue of the black data. The SOSUS network records 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The Bloop event lasted 1 minute. What happened in the hour before? What happened in the hour after? Those files remain classified. If the Bloop was an animal, it didn't just teleport to Point Nemo, scream, and vanish. It had to arrive. It had to leave. Even if it was silent, its movement through the water would displace mass, creating flow noise. If the raw tapes exist, they would show the approach. They would show the acoustic shadow of something massive entering the sensor range. The fact that NOAA only released the vocalization and not the ambient context suggests that the surrounding minutes contained sensitive information. Perhaps the surrounding minutes revealed that the sensor was being tracked, or that there were other fainter calls answering the main signal. The declassification was a surgical strike. They cut out the tumor, the loud noise that everyone was talking about, and burned the rest of the body. The psychological effect of this is profound. It makes us feel like we know the secrets of the deep, when in reality, we have been given a postcard of a war zone. We look at the pretty picture, ignoring the smoke in the background. The archive chill comes from the realization that the folder labeled Bloop on your computer is a construct. It is a piece of media created by an agency to satisfy your curiosity without revealing their capabilities. The icequake explanation is the cover story. It is bland. It is boring. It uses the dull certainty of geology to bury the vibrant terror of biology. But for those who listen closely to the sped-up file, the organic nature of the sound still shines through. Even at 16x speed, it sounds alive. It sounds like a question that ends the silence from the government since 2012 is the loudest sound of all. They have stopped releasing anomalies. The website hasn't been updated with a new mystery sound in over a decade. Does that mean the ocean stopped being mysterious? Or does it mean they stopped sharing the mysteries with us? We are left with the digital remnants of the 90s, the grainy the MP3 files. They are the breadcrumbs of a trail that has been swept away. The declassification event was not an opening of the door. It was the closing of the blind. They showed us one glimpse of the monster, told us it was a rock, and then turned off the lights, but the file is still there. On servers, on hard drives, in the cloud. It waits for someone to look at the metadata again. It waits for someone to crack the code of the 16x speed, and slow it back down to the rhythm of the abyss. As we close the browser window on the NOAA archive, the screen goes black. The reflection of your own face stares back at you. The files are downloaded. The truth is fragmented. The story of the ocean's acoustic shadows is a story of filters. The filter of the water, which absorbs the light. The filter of the sensor, which selects the frequency. The filter of the algorithm, which scrubs the noise. And the filter of the government, which redacts the context. By the time the sound reaches your ears, it has passed through so many layers of censorship that it is barely a ghost of the original event. But the ocean itself has no filters. The water remembers. The sound waves that were generated in 1997 traveled until they hit the continents, bouncing back, dissipating into heat. The energy of the bloop is still part of the ocean's thermal memory. We have walked through the history of the listening network. We have seen the cables of Project Caesar. We have tracked the Soviet subs. We have analyzed we have visited the loneliness of Point Nemo. Now, only one question remains. If the ocean is still there, and the microphones are still on, what are they hearing right now? The archive is closing for the night. The server lights are blinking out one by one, but the deep sound channel is always open. The file was stamped never open. We opened it, we listened, and now, we must decide what to believe.